breaking news, the anchorwoman's voice trembled, her hands quivering on the desk. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has surrendered to the Sivian Party.
Her voice cracked.
The world has fallen under Sivian's tyranny. Only God can protect us now. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her eyes darted off camera, wide with terror. Then came the gunshot. A single bullet pierced her forehead. The screen burst into static. An elderly man turned off the television. His reflection lingered in the darkened screen, gray-haired, deeply wrinkled, eyes like fading embers. With a slow breath, he rose from a luxurious crocodile leather couch adorned with golden buttons. His cane, black diamond inlaid with white gold, tapped softly against the marble floor as he walked away. Servants in the palatial mansion bowed low as he passed, but none met his gaze. Their deference came not from respect, but fear. Through tall windows, he saw soldiers stationed around polished luxury cars. His reflection in the glass reminded him of everything he'd won, and everything he'd lost.
Riches. Power. Emptiness.
"Sir," an aged butler said softly, bowing. "The guests await in the meeting hall."
The old man nodded.
His breath grew heavier with each step as he moved past walls lined with priceless artwork. At the grand doors to the meeting room, guards bearing red Sivian armbands stepped aside, stiff with anxiety. The butler pushed open the doors. Inside, the world's remaining powerhouses, men in suits and uniforms, stood and applauded. At the center, the tyrant Sivian himself, the man who had just conquered the world, clapped with a cruel grin. The old man gave a faint smile. "As promised," he said, voice dry and frail, "the world is yours."
He sat.
The room fell silent, all eyes locked on him. Sivian raised a crystal flute of champagne. "If not for your wisdom and support, none of us would be here. A toast to the fallen who paved our path."
"Salute." The room echoed. Glasses clinked. Champagne flowed.
But within seconds, coughs broke the quiet.
Panic. Clutching necks.
Bodies collapsing one by one. Eyes wide in realization, they had been poisoned. Sivian didn't drink. He spat his champagne into a napkin, smirking. "Did you really think I'd drink it?" But the old man, still seated, watched calmly, untouched. "You didn't drink either?" Sivian asked, eyes narrowing. "Did you think I'd fall for such a clumsy trick?" The old man said, gently placing his untouched glass on the table. Sivian gave a sharp whistle.
Armed guards burst in, rifles aimed.
"I'm just an old man," the elder said, unimpressed. "Do you really need guns to feel safe?" "A lion is still a lion," Sivian replied, approaching. The old man gave a raspy laugh, then coughed hard, his age catching up to him. "I expected more from you," he said quietly. Blood trickled from Sivian's nose.
His legs wobbled. His vision blurred.
When did you?" Sivian gasped, as the butler re-entered masked, swiftly executing the guards. He offered the old man a vial of antidote. "Airborne toxin, delivered through the vents," Sivian muttered, collapsing. Paralysis overtook him. "You entered my den thinking there'd be no price," the old man said coldly. "You were on top of the world. Now, you belong to the dirt." Sivian died with hatred in his eyes. The old man didn't flinch. "The antidote, sir." The butler extended his trembling hand. The old man shook his head.
"I've lived enough. Power tastes like ash.
I want this to be my ending." He looked away from the antidote. The butler's eyes welled with sorrow. "You'll be remembered as a hero who slayed a tyrant, or a villain who helped him rise." "I've made peace with either legacy," the old man whispered. The butler bowed deeply. "It was an honor, my lord." He removed his mask, ready to join his master in death. Kairos Revena, the mastermind of a ruined world, closed his eyes, heart steady.
But death didn't come.
Instead, the air shifted. Soldiers, alerted by the chaos, stormed the hall, weapons raised. They saw the tyrant dead, and the old man still alive. They opened fire. But the bullets froze mid-air. A man landed on the table.
Young. Handsome. Dressed in black.
His voice, calm as a breeze, "He's mine." Kairos opened his eyes to a surreal sight, bullets suspended in time. The young man raised 2 fingers. All the soldiers dropped dead. Kairos's heart pounded for the first time in decades.
Terror. Awe. Excitement.
The man stepped forward, unfurling a scroll from nowhere. "Kairos Revena," he read aloud. "Born in an orphanage.
First kill at age 7.
Rose through blood and betrayal. Architect of a fallen world." Kairos stared, stunned. No wonder even the angel of death races to claim your soul, the man smiled, eyes gleaming crimson. But I got here first. Who are you? Kairos whispered. The young man leaned close, his grin wolfish. I'm what you humans call the devil. He appeared behind Kairos in a blink, placing a hand on his shoulder. This isn't your end, Kairos. This is the beginning. So, his eyes ignited with flame. Let's rewrite your story. Kairos didn't know when it happened. One moment, the devil's hand gripped his shoulders, and the next, he was somewhere else entirely. The air scalded his lungs with every breath, and the heat was so intense his sweat hissed as it evaporated. His throat was parched beyond reason, dry enough to make his mind blur with hallucinations. But no, this wasn't a hallucination. The pain was too real. He opened his eyes and saw towering mountains of molten lava. Smokeless flames danced across the horizon. The sky was blood red, and from every direction came screams unlike anything Kairos had ever heard. Screams not of pain, but of despair so absolute it clawed at the soul.
His body froze.
Oh, those screams! Came a voice smooth and delighted. They belonged to the ones who gave in to greed, pride, envy, wrath, gluttony, sloth and lust. The devil stood beside him, still young and beautiful, still wearing that charming wicked smile. Welcome to hell. He began walking across a long stone bridge that stretched above a lake of writhing fire. Come, let me show you the hospitality we offer. Kairos couldn't move. Every instinct told him to run, yet his body refused. His heart pounded against his ribs as if trying to escape. It took every ounce of will to lift his foot, and the instant it touched the bridge, the sole of his shoe sizzled and melted. He recoiled in pain, but then his feet rose from the ground, carried forward by invisible force, hovering just behind the devil. You're an honored guest, the devil smirked. So I'm treating you gently. You're not dead yet.
Not quite.
As they moved forward, Kairos was forced to witness horrors no mortal was meant to see. Creatures of madness fed sinners swarms of flesh-eating insects. Others gulped lava to quench a thirst that would never die. Some tore at their own skin in futile attempts to scratch the unrelenting itches crawling beneath. Kairos trembled violently, his body coated in cold sweat that evaporated before it could drip. His breath caught in his throat. The scenes burned into his memory like brands. The devil leaned in close, his voice a seductive whisper.
Beautiful, isn't it? And this?
This is just the foyer. Kairos wanted to scream, but couldn't. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. Why did you bring me here? He managed, voice raw and strained like sandpaper across open wounds. The devil straightened, adjusting his flawless black suit. Because God gave you two choices. Die now and stay here, forever. Or take his offer. Kairos blinked.
God? He croaked.
The devil chuckled.
I know. Shocking, right?
The Almighty himself, offering you a second chance.
He licked his lips.
He's got a soft spot for irony, I guess.
So, redemption?
Kairos asked, clinging to hope. The devil's laughter exploded like thunder across the burning skies. Sinners wailed and covered their ears. The torturers shrieked and scattered in fear. Kairos flinched, nearly fainting from the sheer pressure of the sound. Redemption. The devil wiped a tear from his eye. That's the funniest thing I've heard in eons. Then he leaned close again, his smile all teeth and menace. Horns erupted from his brow like obsidian blades. God doesn't want you redeemed. He despised you. Kairos felt his heart fall through the floor. For a moment he accepted it, welcomed the final descent into madness. But the devil stopped laughing and smoothed back his hair, horns retreating.
No. I lied.
He doesn't despise you. Kairos blinked, unsure whether to feel relief or more fear. In fact, he's impressed. The devil's eyes twinkled. You destroyed the world, and somehow brought peace. You toppled evil by becoming evil. That's poetic.
He shrugged.
Satan's furious. That was his job, after all. But hey, you did it better. Kairos's breath caught.
He had won. Not for power. Not for glory. But to tear the system down, and he did.
Now, the devil said, God has another challenge.
A new world. Far more complex than Earth. He bet on the world.
I bet on you. Kairos furrowed his brow. Why would God and the devil gamble on me?
Because we're both bored, the devil grinned.
And you're interesting. Then I choose the new world, Kairos said instantly. Anything but this place.
The devil clapped. Excellent choice.
Kairos glanced one last time at the torment around him. He would carry this memory forever. Hell wasn't fire and brimstone, it was absolute hopelessness.
Before we go, the devil said, halting.
What was your goal, Kairos?
You unleashed chaos.
You slaughtered millions. Then you saved the world.
Why?
Kairos looked him in the eye. You can't read my mind?
The devil smirked.
I want to hear it from you. Kairos's lips curled into a faint smile. I was bored. The devil's laugh shook the realm again. That is perfect. His voice dropped to a low purr. Work for me, Kairos. I'll make you a king down here.
Worshipped. Feared.
I'll grant your every desire. Kairos's smile faded. Why would I work for a being beneath me, he said coldly. You tempt humans, but you fear them. Your power ends at the border of our will. The devil's grin twitched. For the first time, he looked up, at the blood-red sky. I like you, Kairos. He waved his hand, and a black hole opened behind the old man. Let's see how well you can break a new world. And with a flick of the devil's fingers, Kairos' Revener was gone.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Kairos' head was spinning roughly so that he threw up before he could even open his eyes. When he opened his eyes, he saw the vomit on the dusty and dirty floor in front of him. He slowly lifted his head and found out that he was in a dark, moldy, and cold room where everything was covered in dust. Where am I? Kairos asked, but his voice sounded so young. He looked around and noticed he was inside a cabin because the walls, ceiling, and floor were made of planks of wood.
Wait.
Kairos noticed the change in his voice. He looked around to find something that could show reflection. He realized that his health and body were worse than his old body. He could see how thin his arms were, and he could see the shapes of his bones. Kairos looked at the dusty window as he wiped it with his dirty and stinky sleeves. He looked at his white messy short hair and blue eyes which he didn't recognize at all. He thought he was dreaming until he felt a stomach ache because of extreme hunger.
Who are you?
Kairos muttered in pain as he stared at his reflection with narrowed eyes. He had so many questions in his head, but nothing made sense. The only thing he could think of was that he had been transferred into a new world in a new body. He remembered what the devil had said back then. Young master.
Are you all right?
I heard you vomit. A butler barged into the room with a panicked expression. Kairos tilted his head as he looked at the butler over his shoulder. He had many things going on in his head, and he began to feel feverish from thinking and moving.
Who are you?
Kairos furrowed his brows. The butler tilted his head with a confused and worried look. I'm your butler, young master. The butler's voice was quiet and soft with a confused look. Kairos decided to sit on the edge bed because his body couldn't handle it anymore. He knew that his health had worsened, so he tried to not exhaust himself. The butler looked at the vomit and thought for a moment if he wanted to even clean the vomit. At the same time, Kairos noticed how clean the butler's uniform was and how healthy his body was compared to him. Something wasn't right until he looked at the butler's slick hair. You can stop pretending, devil, Kairos said as he lay down on the bed and hugged his stomach. The butler's confused face suddenly changed into a terrifying grin that his mouth was wide open from ear to ear. He knew that he couldn't fool Kairos. You're sharp and I hate that, the devil said as he leaned against the wall. Let me help you, he snapped his fingers. Kairos' body became lighter and he was no longer in pain. Although he felt a lot better, his body was still weak. Where are we?
Who am I?
And what is this place? Kairos asked as he leaned against the dirty wall behind the bed.
Your new world.
It's called Neva, where it's 3 times bigger than Earth, the devil answered as he looked at how dirty the room was. You're a fallen noble that tried to scheme against the Rafinus kingdom. For what your parents did, the world agreed to kill all your family and let one live to keep the bloodline, he explained. And my name is? The old man raised his eyebrows. Rasmus, of the Blackheart from the Rafinus kingdom, the devil answered with his arms crossed. That's all I know from looking into your soul. They spared one life to keep the family name existing. That means the Blackheart is an important family in this world, Rasmus muttered to himself and narrowed his eyes. Wait, what did you just say? He glanced at the devil with his brows furrowed. I'm as clueless as you are. I know nothing about this new world, the devil crossed his arms as he stared at Rasmus. You will regain your memories, so you'll get all the answers you're looking for because you're no longer Kairos, you're Rasmus. Kairos closed his eyes and tried to read the memories of Rasmus, the body that he had taken over. He could see fragments of memories, split images of them which were hard to tell about Rasmus' past. But, he found a lot of information about the world he was in from those fragments and images. He was brought into a unique world that was similar to the Georgian era, where the nobles and hierarchy were still strong and controlled the world. What made it unique was that magic and divine power existed and everyone depended on them in their daily lives. You said that God wants me to turn this world upside down. Rasmus muttered as he looked outside the window and noticed he lived in the middle of the forest where the trees were gigantic.
That's the premise, the devil nodded.
But we both know it won't be that easy.
He added.
Of course, there's always a twist. Rasmus decided to go outside to see the world he was in. Rasmus couldn't exhaust himself if he didn't want to collapse, but he had no choice because he needed something to eat and drink. The devil was following him, and it made him feel uneasy because the devil's gaze gave him chills and made him shiver. He was too afraid to have thoughts because the devil could read his mind. He didn't want to be on the devil's bad side, not until he knew more about him and his purpose. You said you know nothing about this world, is that right? Rasmus asked as he looked at the mushroom that grew on the roots of the trees. He didn't know if it was edible or not, but he knew once he cooked it and tasted it a bit. I just came to this world after you, so I know nothing yet, the devil answered as he watched Rasmus collect different types of mushrooms. You're useless for someone who's going to help me. Rasmus looked at the devil from over his shoulder with suspicion. The devil grinned widely as he looked down, hiding his face. Rasmus thought about it thoroughly as he gathered the mushrooms. He knew it wasn't that simple, especially after he observed the devil and how he played with words and hid half the truth every time. By the way, those mushrooms are all poisonous. Even a tiny bite is enough to kill you, the devil pointed out as he scoffed. Rasmus stared blankly at the trees when he heard what the devil said. He dropped the mushrooms that he had collected for minutes. He was convinced about how the devil played his game, which was making himself dance on the palm of the devil's hand for entertainment. He took a few dried leaves and branches from the ground to make a fireplace since it was cold. He found a few herbs that seemed edible, and he planned to boil it to fill his stomach. Once he was done, he went inside the building and warmed his body with the fireplace as he boiled water at the same time. You said you made a bet with God, that means you're not going to stay put when things don't go as you want them to be, right? Rasmus put his hands near the fireplace.
You're too keen. I hate that.
The devil smirked playfully. His words and expressions didn't match.
That's right.
I'm allowed to give you hands since we are against God after all, but there's a limit to that, he nodded as he leaned his shoulder against the fireplace. You've done it once back on Earth. From a nobody who was abandoned and then climbed your way up to the point you ruled the world, the devil looked at Rasmus. It's not that hard to do it once again, right? He continued with a faint smirk. Rasmus hummed as he closed his eyes after he ate the herbs he found that were enough to fill his stomach. He made himself comfortable in the living room, which had nothing but a fireplace. He tried to read Rasmus's memories. He had so much free time in his past life during his old age, so he knew exactly how to meditate. He connected the fragments of memories like a puzzle and found out about Rasmus' past and his family. He discovered a crucial piece of knowledge, the existence of mana. So my family is a magic expert, a powerful family at it as well. Rasmus furrowed as he tried to understand how to use magic. My father was a count and I have inherited that title, he muttered as he looked at the herbs in his hand. A lord without a land, what a joke, he continued as his eyes were focused on the burning woods. Rasmus imagined creating fire through combustion that replaced the elements and materials with that flowing energy around him, and it was enough to light a fire on his right index finger. It was so small, but it was enough to light the wood again. I'm impressed, the devil was mildly shocked as he raised his eyebrows. So you know how to use mana now, he crossed his arms, observing Rasmus. Barely, Rasmus felt weak after he manipulated mana to turn into fire. This thing called mana, it can act as hydrogen, oxygen, and other elements. Rasmus muttered to himself and thought of the possibility that he could achieve with mana.
Interesting, isn't it?
But you know it's too good to be true, the devil grinned as he stared into Rasmus's eyes and read his thoughts. Rasmus hummed and nodded in agreement. The knowledge about mana was still basic because the original owner of Rasmus's body barely understood it since he got banished when he was still young. He was just an innocent child who knew nothing. Mana isn't unlimited and has a limit just like any natural energy and element. Rasmus muttered as he rubbed his fingertips. I should get some rest because my body is asking me to rest, but I don't feel safe with you around, he glanced at the devil coldly. I promised to God that I wouldn't deceive you or try to harm you. If I did, God would punish me and send me back to hell, taking my vacation away, the devil assured as he raised his hands. My job here is to be your guide and accompany you until the end. But that doesn't mean you can't hide the truth, just like how you toyed with me when I gathered mushrooms. Rasmus responded as his gaze narrowed with suspicion. You don't want me to do this in an easy way, don't you? The devil chuckled mischievously as he sat down with his cheek resting on his fist. Rasmus observed the devil who was supposed to be guiding him throughout his journey. He knew that he couldn't show any vulnerability near the devil because he knew that one day the devil would use him as his pawn.
Don't bother me.
I need to rest now. Rasmus slowly stood up and his legs were shaking because of how weak his body was. The devil raised his hands as he watched Rasmus walk back to his room. Rasmus felt restless when he was asleep because of his empty stomach. He could barely sleep, but his body was too weak to stay awake.
This is pointless.
Rasmus sighed as he sat up and rubbed his messy hair. I need to find something to eat, he muttered and got up from the bed. Rasmus remembered there was a small village not far from the forest. He thought for a moment and decided to pay it a visit even though it gave him bad memories because nobody treated him nicely. I'm no longer Kairos. Rasmus stared at himself in the mirror. This foreign feeling feels weird and yet real, he said under his breath when Rasmus's memories affected him deeply. He walked out of his room and found the devil staring out the window. When the devil noticed that he was being stared at, he glanced at Rasmus with a cold gaze. You want to pay the village a visit? The devil asked with his brows raised after he read Rasmus's thought. Yes, to get something to eat or we both will go back to hell if I die from starvation, right? Rasmus asked as he rolled his sleeves. How are you going to do that? Begging for food. The devil arched his brow as he observed Rasmus's skinny body. What's wrong with that? Rasmus raised his brows as he walked toward the front door. The devil shook his head in disbelief and then watched Rasmus leave the cabin. He was surprised that Rasmus took this whole situation as if it was nothing. He was expecting Rasmus to be overwhelmed by the new reality. Rasmus left the forest and looked at the brick-paved road that led to the nearest town. He tried to regain more of Rasmus' memories of the world he lived in as he saw the beautiful world he was in. His bare feet followed the path and the only thing that he felt at that moment was excitement. Herjel village. The furthest village in the Rafinus kingdom. Rasmus looked at the small village from the top of the hill. He looked at the village which looked so beautiful because he loved Georgian architecture. Its symmetry, elegance, and simplicity seemed timeless and pleasant to look at. The city had a river that split the village into two sides and the smoke that came out of the chimney made the scenery look like it came out of a fantasy movie. He walked into the village in his ragged clothes where everyone looked at him with pity, but seeing his white hair, they knew who he was. He ignored the gazes and went straight to the market where people sold bread and other food. I don't have any money. Rasmus looked at the warm bread in front of him as he wiped his drool. Do you have any bread you've discarded or can't sell? He looked at the man who stood behind the stall, his voice weak and shaky. The man knew who Rasmus was, but seeing how skinny his body was, made the man pity him and gave him 2 breads without saying anything. Rasmus immediately bowed his head and even went down to his knees to show gratification. Everyone saw the gesture that he made to the baker. Some were touched and pitied him, while some were disgusted because he was a Blackheart. Rasmus didn't mind the gazes and immediately walked away as he hugged the 2 breads tightly. The moment he went into an alley to eat his bread, the devil appeared beside him with a cold gaze pointed at him. Rasmus couldn't read the devil's expression at all, and it was unnerving. That was easy, the devil looked at Rasmus with his brows furrowed as he scoffed. That's human for you. Rasmus paused and looked at the devil as he took a bite. There's a reason why humans are God's greatest creation, he continued with a smirk. The devil couldn't stop staring at Rasmus with his eyes fixated on Rasmus's eyes. His stoic expression was impossible to decipher and what he had in his mind. You want one? It's delicious, Rasmus offered the other bread to the devil. The devil looked at the bread for a moment before he took it from Rasmus's hand. What should I call you? Rasmus asked as he munched on the bread and glanced at the devil. Since you're my butler, at least I need to address you properly. Videl, the devil took a bite of the bread. You're not kidding. This bread is delicious. He shrugged his mouth, surprised by the taste, and took another bite. Videl. Rasmus scoffed. For a powerful being, you came up with such a stupid name. A month had passed since Kairos became Rasmus and was brought to Neva. His utmost priority was to regain his health and gather information from the villagers about Neva. To survive, he needed money, and the easiest way to earn it was by selling dried wood and herbs. Good morning, Rasmus greeted the guards with a soft smile, fully aware of their hatred for his lineage. He had learned that white hair was uncommon in Neva, especially in the southwest where it was almost non-existent. While his father had black hair, his unusual white hair came from his mother. Ah, you really came. A young woman hurriedly approached Rasmus as she watched him struggle under the weight of dried wood on his back. "Let me help you," she offered. "I'm fine. I need to train my body as well, so I'll carry them myself." Rasmus shook his head with a smile. "Where should I put this?" he asked, glancing at the bakery store. The woman guided Rasmus to the back where they stored the dried wood. "Here you go, your payment." The young woman handed him 5 copper coins. "Also, I baked this just for you. Please take it." She offered a loaf of bread with a gentle smile on her face. Rasmus accepted the bread, which was worth 2 coppers in itself. Essentially, he was being paid 7 coppers, and he was happy to accept the offer. 5 copper for dried wood. "It's not worth the time and effort," Vidal commented, appearing beside Rasmus with his stoic expression. Vidal had the ability to come and go as he pleased, invisible to others. He often disguised himself as a traveler or adventurer, finding pleasure wherever he could, indulging in the company of both men and women. Sometimes he gathered information for Rasmus. "Money isn't my goal. It's about making a name for myself and receiving acknowledgement from the villagers," Rasmus responded as he checked the freshness of the herbs in the bag he made from leaves and tree bark. "You do you. It's time for me to spend the day with the lady from the pub." "Don't bother me," Vidal sighed, disappearing like smoke. Rasmus sold the herbs for 10 copper, more than he earned from the dried wood. The herbalist, an old man with a wealth of knowledge, taught him how to make medicine and supplements to improve his health. 10, 20, 26. Rasmus counted the coppers he earned for the day in his hand. "I can buy the book I wanted," he muttered, putting the money in his bag. "There you are. The parasite that keeps dirtying our village." A man emerged from a dark alley, blocking Rasmus's path. "Looks like you got some money there." Everyone's eyes were on Rasmus and the 6 thugs. Some smiled and smirked, enjoying his trouble, while others pitied him. "I do." "You can have it," Rasmus said, offering his bag to the thugs with a stoic expression. One of the thugs grabbed the bread from Rasmus's hand, then dropped it and stepped on it, covering it in the dirt before kicking it away. A dog quickly snatched the bread, but Rasmus remained unbothered, his lack of reaction surprising the thugs. "Can I go now?" Rasmus asked calmly, staring fearlessly into the thug's eyes. The thug smacked Rasmus, sending him to the ground. They all laughed before leaving him alone. Vidal appeared in front of Rasmus, looking down at him with disgust. "What the fuck was that?" "You're pathetic." "Because I need their sympathy," Rasmus mumbled, not wanting anyone to see him talking to himself. "Also, I'm not pathetic. I'm just trying to be pitiful," he said, standing up and brushing off the dirt on his ragged clothing. Vidal furrowed his brow in confusion until the young woman from the bakery store approached Rasmus. "Are you all right? I can give you another one. Wait here for a moment." She frowned and checked Rasmus over before leaving to fetch more bread. "Compassion, right?" Rasmus's voice was barely above a whisper, glancing at Vidal, trying to hide his smirk. "You do you. That's what you said, right?" He raised his eyebrows. Vidal crossed his arms and rolled his eyes, unamused by what he witnessed. "Humans are weird and pathetic. What's next? Begging for scraps and calling it a strategy." Rasmus responded with a soft smirk and a scoff. He then glanced at a bunch of kids who were staring at him. The moment their eyes met with his, they all ran away out of fear because of his lineage and white hair. "Rasmus." A man with a rough and deep voice called Rasmus. "I need your help, can you come with me for a second?" Rasmus turned around and looked at the big muscular man. "Edouard? You're back already." Rasmus raised his brows in disbelief. Edouard was a merchant, but Rasmus knew that his background wasn't ordinary, unlike the other villagers. His appearance and scars all over his body were enough to convince Rasmus that Edouard had an interesting past. "What can I say? My goods are always the best compared to the other merchants. It didn't take a while for the townspeople to buy everything that I offer," Edouard smirked as he crossed his arms. "Anyway, can you help me? I need your talent in magic." "The usual." "Sure." Rasmus nodded and walked toward Edouard. A moment later, they arrived at the back of Edouard's house, which was a farm. Edouard wanted Rasmus to water the whole farm in exchange for 1 silver. Rasmus didn't mind, and it only took him less than a minute to create a rain at Edouard's backyard. "No matter how many times I saw it, your talent in magic is just mind-blowing," Edouard scoffed as he shook his head in disbelief. "It's not that hard to do. If you know how rain works, it's like flipping a hand," Rasmus said as he sat down on the ground and watched his magic creation pour over Edouard's farm. "The Blackheart family, huh? I guess the rumor about the family that produced magic genius is true after all." Edouard muttered to himself as he sat beside Rasmus. You know, if you teach kids with magic talents, you'll get a lot of money, right? He glanced at Rasmus with his brows raised. Although it was true that the Blackheart family was known for their talent for magic, the real Rasmus was just an innocent child who got punished and exiled. He didn't know anything about advanced magic. It was Kairos who knew how nature works and the science behind it. He used both mana and his knowledge to create magic.
Teaching?
That's not a bad idea, but I'm just an outcast. I need recognition first from the villagers because right now, a lot of them still hate me for who I am, Rasmus answered as he watched the rain he made. I can help you with that, you know? I'm the richest merchant in the village. Edward looked at Rasmus with a serious expression. Rasmus showed a faint smile as he shook his head. You can't force someone to change their view. Let it be done naturally, he responded as he watched the plants feed on the rainwater. I guess you're right. Edward nodded in agreement. But if you need help, don't be shy to come to me. He tossed a silver coin at Rasmus. Thanks, Rasmus smiled as he caught the silver coin.
Another month had passed.
Rasmus's health improved drastically thanks to his training, medicines, and supplements that he made. He also got the book that he wanted, so he decided to take a day off to read. Have you heard? Vidal barged into the small, rustic cabin, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. He yawned, the sunlight filtering through the cracked window highlighting his tired expression. Those thugs that kept bothering you got kicked out of the village. The villagers complained about them, so the chief banished them. He sat down across the table from Rasmus. Once I got their sympathy and empathy, they began to help me. I barely did anything and look what I got in return from being pitiful, Rasmus said as he kept reading the book. Sometimes life is simple if you don't take things too seriously. Vidal squinted his eyes, a slow, simmering disbelief brewing within him. As the devil, he couldn't fathom how someone could manipulate outcomes so seamlessly while appearing so indifferent. What's that book you're reading? Vidal asked as he rested his head on his fist. History and politics. The old Rasmus has no idea how the world works, so his memories are useless for this kind of stuff. After all, he was banished for 10 years since he was 12, Rasmus answered as he flipped the page. As Rasmus read the book, he thought about how he could use this newfound knowledge. Understanding the history and politics of Neva was crucial. If he could grasp the intricacies of power and influence, he could maneuver more effectively and achieve his ultimate goal. Vidal looked bored, his eyes drifting aimlessly around the cabin. He hadn't found anyone interesting in the village. You spent 20 years working as a mercenary. I thought you would kill those thugs or at least harm them, Vidal said, staring at Rasmus, who was focused on his book. Who said I won't kill them? Rasmus replied, looking intellectual with his legs crossed and the book held in his left hand. You know where they are, right? I want to visit them later. Vidal raised his brows and then a huge grin formed on his face. But then he furrowed his brows, crossed his arms, and stared down at Rasmus. You know this world isn't about guns and bombs. This world uses magic, swords, shields, and arrows to fight. Your combat skills aren't enough, Vidal pointed out, his boredom evident as he began tapping on the table with blank eyes. Rasmus glanced at Vidal, curious about what he was implying.
That's true, but what's your point?
Do you perhaps want to teach me how to wield weapons? Rasmus asked, raising his brows. It helps with muscle growth as well, which is something you're trying to do, Vidal smirked mischievously, staring into Rasmus's eyes. Are you really that bored that you decided to help me? Rasmus stared back at Vidal, surprised by the prospect of having a normal conversation with the devil, the most feared being and the ruler of hell. I don't want to admit that, Vidal jolted from his seat, then slammed his left hand on the table.
So? Are you in or not?
Rasmus closed the book and placed it on the table.
I'm in, he nodded as he stood up.
Rasmus followed Vidal to the backyard, his curiosity piqued. He watched in awe as Vidal's right hand phased through the trunk of a gigantic tree. Moments later, Vidal withdrew his hand, now gripping two wooden swords. He tossed one at Rasmus. This wooden sword is heavy, Rasmus thought as he hefted the weapon. He had to use both hands to hold it properly. Let's begin with the basics. Stances and grips, Vidal suggested, spinning the heavy wooden sword effortlessly before balancing it on his fingertip. Or we can just start with a spar. In a flash, he was in front of Rasmus and swung the sword down vertically. Rasmus, barely able to hold the sword properly, was forced to block Vidal's attack. He mustered all his strength, but the attempt was futile. His wrists twisted painfully, and the sword flew from his grasp. He dropped to his knees, stifling a scream as veins bulged on his neck and forehead. My bad. Vidal chuckled, resting his wooden sword on his left shoulder. I forgot how weak you are. Rasmus lifted his head slowly, realizing Vidal had intended to hurt him from the start. He remembered Vidal's promise not to harm him or deceive him. You broke your promise to God. Rasmus muttered under his breath. Vidal looked skyward, his lips forming a shrug. It seemed he was communicating with someone unseen. God is fine with that since I said it was for your training, Vidal chuckled, looking down at Rasmus. Am I wrong? He raised his brows, his grin wide and threatening, hinting at more pain to come. I should have known. Rasmus said as he struggled to his feet and sighed. But I can't hold a sword with these hands. He showed his swollen wrists and hands to Vidal. Is it? Vidal pointed, and miraculously, Rasmus's hands healed before his eyes. I'm not your toy when you're bored. Rasmus muttered as he walked over to retrieve the wooden sword. Remind me next time to ignore you when you're bored. He readied his stance again, his eyes locking onto Vidal's. So stingy. Vidal chuckled as he readied his stance. Enough with the talk. Watch and learn. The day turned into the night in the blink of an eye, but not for Rasmus. He was lying on the ground on his belly with his broken hands and fingers. It was so painful that he got a fever and was close to passing out. How was it? Did it remind you of the countless times you got tortured in your past life? Vidal chuckled mischievously as he patted the wooden sword on his shoulder and looked down at Rasmus. Fuck off. Rasmus muttered in his shaky voice as he pushed himself up with his elbows. Vidal laughed to his heart's content, holding his stomach because he could finally make Rasmus pissed for the first time. He didn't expect it to be this satisfying because he had been trying to put Rasmus on edge and push his button. He enjoyed every second of Rasmus trying to get up but was unable to do so. Alright, I'm done playing around. Vidal snapped his fingers and healed Rasmus's body completely. Rasmus gasped as he felt immense relief because the pain from the broken bones all over his body disappeared. He went on all four and processed everything that he had learned from the spar he did with Vidal. Are you giving up already? I never thought you were this weak, or is it because you had forgotten what pain feels like that makes you both physically and mentally weak? Vidal chuckled as he crossed his arms. Rasmus couldn't argue with Vidal's words because it had been decades since he felt pain. He might be smart and cunning, but it wasn't enough because he didn't know what kind of challenges he would face in the future. Magic and divine power exist in this world. Strong knights and warriors who conquered others with force also exist. I need to get used to this kind of pain again. Rasmus thought as he closed his eyes. That's more like it, Vidal said with a smirk written on his face after he read Rasmus's thoughts. Enhance. Rasmus was looking through the shelves in the bookstore for books that he might find interesting. When he looked at a certain book which had a black cover, it piqued his interest and he decided to check what kind of book it was. I knew you would be interested in that book, Count. A slit-eyed old man stared at Rasmus with his hands on his back. The great era of Neva, an era of the most influential and powerful families, tried to conquer the whole world. Rasmus looked at the cover as he brushed off the dust from it before he read the title of the book. You startled me, Henry. Rasmus's voice was quiet as he turned his head to look at the old man. The old man chuckled weakly as he nodded and walked toward Rasmus. His weary and skinny body had no sign of flesh in between his skin and bones. I thought coming back to my hometown was a huge mistake. The old man looked around at his book collection. But now I'm grateful that finally there's someone interested in my collection. Rasmus didn't say a word and let the old man continue to speak as he looked at the shelves that had been collecting dust. He realized the old man no longer had the strength to take care of his own collection. Back when I was still a scholar, everyone treated a single paper of knowledge like gold. Everyone would fight over that paper and would digest the new knowledge they got from it, then find a new perspective of life. The old man smiled faintly with his eyes closed. But here, the books are covered in dust, unwanted and ignored. The wise are humble while the fool is arrogant, Rasmus responded as he opened the book and read the first page. But it can be the opposite sometimes. The old man chuckled weakly as he nodded in agreement. Would you like a cup of tea, Count? My days are numbered, and I would love to have one last valuable conversation with someone who seems to have seen the world differently. The old man slowly turned his head to look at Rasmus. Especially about that book you're holding. The book that holds truths that even the wisest minds have struggled to grasp. With pleasure, Rasmus smiled softly as he nodded. Rasmus sat down at an old table and began to read the book that he had taken earlier. He took his time to read each sentence thoroughly, and it was Kairos' habit to read and understand the author's character through their writings. The old man sat across from Rasmus, enjoying his tea and trying to remember the content of each page of the book. He had read that book countless times and he still couldn't understand the reason behind the conflict between the influential and powerful families in Neva. The book of the Great Era of Neva was about the 4 powerful families in Neva that happened 400 years ago. The families were the Suncrown, the Kingswell, the Langley, and the Servile Union. The Suncrown family was the most powerful family in the central of Neva and had over 9 kingdoms that supported them. The Kingswell family was the most influential in the west of Neva. It was supported by 4 kingdoms and a League of Wealth, which was a league of the most influential merchants around Neva. The Langley family was the sole ruler of the south of Neva, which got complete support from all the families that existed in the south of Neva. Lastly, the Servile Union was led by Servile, a woman who raised and fought for the status of women in Neva and turned them into formidable warriors. Although northern Neva wasn't mentioned, that territory had its own conflict that everyone knew about. It was a battle against a powerful tyrant who tried to conquer northern Neva, and it had its own book. The book stated that the spark of the conflict began when those 3 families produced an heir. Asher Suncrown, Alexandra Vane, Roman Ardentes, and Servile were born into Neva in the same year. They were geniuses of their time in terms of strength, strategy, and politics. The 4 of them enrolled in the Gratlin Academy, the most prestigious academy in Neva. The Gratlin Academy. Rasmus muttered to himself as he kept his eyes on the page in front of him. Yes, the floating island where the Council of Neva meets annually. The island of the great were heroes who unified the world and named it Neva. Only those who are chosen can live up there, Henry nodded as he stared at his own reflection in the teacup. My father graduated there. Rasmus hummed and remembered the memories of his father. Henry nodded slowly as he took a sip of his tea. Rasmus continued to read about the beginning of the conflict based on what the author wrote. Unfortunately, there was so little evidence as to why they chose to fight against each other. The words from professors and the chancellor were the only ones who witnessed those figures debate and argue about the system that ran the world. The event was so intense that nobody dared to stop them and chose to watch and listen. That moment was the only moment during their enrollment in the academy where those figures would be in the same place and talk to each other. That was their only encounter with each other before they decided to go their separate ways and focus on their studies.
A broken system?
Rasmus muttered to himself with his brows raised. Unfortunately, that was all they knew. As to why they ended up debating about that and believed the system was broken back then is still unknown, Henry responded as he looked at the page that Rasmus was staring at. They were prominent figures who had critical minds, but why they chose to go against each other when they could forge a better future? Their ideologies. Rasmus lifted his head to look at Henry. That's the only possible answer. Even animals only need one leader, and that's why wolves or lions tend to fight each other for that position and take everything from the other. Of course, but they chose violence and created chaos, harming those who were innocent and powerless. They weren't that kind of people, and the author stated that it wasn't the only case. Henry pointed at the book in Rasmus's hands. The answer lies in that debate where they were arguing about the broken system. Since there was nobody there from the beginning, it will remain a mystery, Rasmus nodded, agreeing with what Henry said. But the author or everyone at that time might be wrong about these figures, he added as he looked down at the book he was holding. What do you mean that they might be wrong? Henry furrowed his brows as he tilted his head and stared at Rasmus. Rasmus gave a faint smirk as he flipped the page, letting the silence take its time. Before I answer your question, how about I ask you a similar question to you? What do you think about my father? The former Count of Blackheart family, Erglade Blackheart, and my mother Aristoria Blackheart. Rasmus stared into Henry's eyes with a sharp gaze. You believed those figures were respectable, and so was my father before he decided to raise his banner against the royal family. What made them and my father different when all of them suddenly became a completely different person? He raised his brows and intertwined his fingers. Henry was taken aback by the question and he didn't know what to say. As a scholar and a wise man, he didn't want to jump to a conclusion without thinking about it thoroughly. The answer might be because it was necessary, Rasmus revealed before Henry could find the right answer. They knew what others didn't. He added and showed a serious expression. Necessary. Henry tilted his head, his eyes narrowed as he sat straight. What part of it requires killing innocent people? Children? And those who had nothing to do with the conflicts between those figures? He asked as he rested his arms on the table. Yes, Rasmus answered and nodded without hesitation. Don't you see that it's wrong no matter how you see it? Henry furrowed his brows, baffled by the answer that Rasmus gave him. A young man, not even half his age, could say something like that without consideration. Right or wrong? It doesn't matter. For example, murder is wrong, but when it comes to protecting one's family, it's necessary. It's about the context and what's necessary, Rasmus responded and stared into Henry's eyes. So you assume those figures, including what your father did, they did it for the greater good? Henry asked and stared into Rasmus's eyes as well. If only life was that simple, Henry. Sometimes, it's not about what is good or bad, it's necessary. For example, my life, you won't understand what I have been through, and you never will because my reality and yours aren't the same. Rasmus shook his head, tapping his forefinger at the table. Henry took a deep breath as he looked at Rasmus's expression, a hint of what kind of man he was. He never thought that Rasmus could say such a thing, but then he realized that the man who sat in front of him was exiled and abandoned when he was 12 years old, surviving on his own for a decade. But that way of thinking is dangerous, Count. You see what fits in your reality, which isn't a good thing to have, Henry responded in a calm and gentle voice, leaning his body forward. I know what you have been through, abandoned and exiled. But it was not the world's fault that made you that way, it was the people. Don't turn your back on the world because without it, you won't be here. The world is beautiful and innocent in a way, he added with concern in his voice. So what's your point, old man? Rasmus raised his left brow, leaning forward, and rested his cheek on his fist. I'm not trying to educate you or try to force my view into your life. What I want is for you to not make those who have suffered suffer even more. Henry smiled as he stared at his own wrinkled hand. Rasmus looked down and hid his smile as he stood up. He took a deep breath before he lifted his head to look at Henry. You remind me of someone. Rasmus grabbed the book and held it tightly. Someone who was dear to me in a way, he continued, staring blankly at the old table. Oh? Was he a wise man? Henry raised his brows and looked up at the young man. No. Rasmus shook his head as he chuckled. It was because he understood, he explained as he looked the old man in the eyes, reminding him of his old butler in his previous life. When Henry heard the answer, the anxiety and concern in his head about Rasmus's personality was slowly fading away. He realized the young man who stood in front of him was different. He had never seen anyone like him before, and deep down he felt that Rasmus could bring a change to Neva for better or worse. It seems that we have deviated from our discussion quite far. I'll take my time reading the rest of this book in my cabin, and I'll come back to discuss this matter with you once I'm done, Rasmus said as he looked at the book in his hand. Henry smiled faintly as he nodded his head. Then you don't have to pay for that book. In exchange, you have to tell me what you find in that book, Henry responded as he slowly stood up from his chair. That's a fair trade, Rasmus smirked as he nodded and then left the bookstore. Rasmus took a short walk in the village and everyone had begun to greet him with a warm smile. He finally got everyone's acknowledgement and recognition, made his life in the past 3 months in the village comfortable. Sir Rasmus, good morning. A small girl's voice could be heard from behind Rasmus. Rasmus turned around and saw a group of children standing in line as they looked up at him. He gave a warm and gentle smile at them as he went down to his knee to level his head with them. Sinclair, Abigail, Cinder, good morning, Rasmus said in a soft and gentle voice as he patted their heads. What can I help you today? He looked at them with his brows raised. We. Sinclair paused to look at Abigail and Cinder. We want to learn magic, sir. She looked at Rasmus nervously. Magic? Do you have an aptitude for it? Rasmus tilted his head a bit. The first book that Rasmus read was advanced research about mana and how to use it efficiently. He already knew the basics and a few methods that were only passed down to the Blackheart family. He believed with his modern knowledge he could create something new. The introduction about mana was revealed in the book that mana was a result of the heat that the dragon veins produced. The heat couldn't be detected by people who had no sensitivity to mana. There were stages of magical aptitude to detect someone's sensitivity through a certain method. Dormant stage, which meant they were unable to detect mana and they couldn't utilize it no matter how hard they tried to learn magic. Awakening stage, which meant they were capable of detecting mana just like a wind that grazed their skin. This way, some didn't realize they could detect mana until they were in a thick and rich mana. It would be hard to tell since it felt like a normal gentle wind most of the time. Perception stage, which meant they were capable of detecting and differentiating between mana and wind. They could utilize mana better than the awakening stage, which made it easier for them to learn magic compared to the awakening stage. Flux stage, which meant they were capable of detecting mana and the flow of it. Some were capable of manipulating the flow while some couldn't. Either way, they could easily learn magic and they could also learn to turn mana into aura. Only 18% of Neva's population was gifted with this ability. Arcane stage, which meant they could detect mana, sense the flow of mana, and smell mana. Mana had a scent and it could be used to inform them that someone could sense mana or not. The scent could also tell how powerful someone was by smelling how soft or strong the scent of the mana around them was. Only 0.4% of Neva's population was gifted with this ability. Sage stage, which was the highest, meant they could see the color of mana and the amount of mana with their eyes. There were only a handful of people in the past 1,000 years that had reached this level. Only 0.0001% of Neva's population was gifted with this ability. Rasmus was at the flux stage and there was no information related to the stages and how to increase it. It didn't bother him that much because what he had was more than enough to understand mana and magic. We were told by a mage that we are in the awakening stage. Cinder looked at Rasmus with her bright blue eyes. Is that so? Then let's give it a try, Rasmus smiled as he stood up. Let's borrow Edward's land, shall we? The three girls smiled widely as they nodded their heads repeatedly. Rasmus crossed his arms, watching the children with an aptitude for magic try to create a fire for mana. He knew that the Rafinus kingdom produced the most mages compared to the other regions in central Neva, but he didn't expect there were quite a few of the children from the village that had an aptitude for magic. It was less than a month since you brought Sinclair, Abigail, and Cinder here. Now look at the other children here. You really made a name for yourself now, huh? Edward stood beside Rasmus as he crossed his arms. Did the parents pay you well? He smirked as he glanced at Rasmus. I do it for free. Rasmus shook his head as he observed that a few of the children had managed to create a spark in between their hands. Free? Edward's eyes widened as he stared at Rasmus in disbelief. You know you can make a fortune from this. Well, it seems you're no merchant, he sighed in disappointment and shook his head. Rasmus only responded with a faint smirk and a soft scoff. Anyway, there's something that I'm worried about. Edward's tone and expression changed drastically into a serious one. Rasmus glanced at Edward and wondered what made Edward look so concerned. He knew Edward, and he had never seen him that concerned before. You need to be careful, Rasmus, Edward said in a quiet voice. I heard rumors that some kind of people are looking for you, he pointed out as he stared into Rasmus's eyes. Some kind of people? Like bad people. Rasmus crossed his arms and his focus was on Edward's expression. Edward nodded slowly as he glanced at the children and their parents on the sides. They're not bandits or thugs. They're more organized and well known in the underworld, he explained. Rasmus hummed as he nodded with understanding and looked at the faces of the parents. He knew what it was all about before Edward had to explain the details. He knew his lineage was useful for criminals and they would use his suffering and desperation to join them. How good these people are. Rasmus glanced at Edward. I don't know much about them. I heard about it from the other merchants when I was in the capital city and on my way back here. I'll find some information about them if you want me to, Edward said as he shook his head. No, that's fine. I can't afford to pay you for that, and since you said you're a merchant, you won't do things for free, right? Rasmus smirked at Edward. I know someone else that can do that for me, willingly. Edward furrowed his brows as he watched Rasmus walk away and approach the children. He wondered who it was, the person that Rasmus could ask to do something like that. As the sun went down, the children left the field with their parents after Rasmus taught them the basics of science and physics. Rasmus went to his cabin with a few ingredients for dinner and bread for Videl. Catch. Rasmus threw the bread at Videl, who was sitting at the table. Videl caught the bread and ate the freshly baked bread where the crisp could be heard in the living room when he took a bite. He watched Rasmus sit across from him with a serious expression. He couldn't help but read Rasmus's thoughts and find out what it was all about. You want me to go to the capital city? Videl smirked as he rested his head on his fist. Yes, and you can sleep with all the men and women you want. I believe people who live in the city are more alluring, Rasmus said as he stared into Videl's eyes. Videl grinned widely as he reached out his hand toward Rasmus and opened it. That gesture made Rasmus look a bit confused. Pocket money, Videl explained as he looked at his palm. You can easily steal their money and use it on prostitutes. It's a perfect opportunity to gather information about this organization from those women. Rasmus slapped Videl's hand away from his face. Videl laughed as he retracted his hand and nodded. How long do you want me to stay in the capital? Videl cleaned his hand from the breadcrumb. A week or two. Enjoy your time there, Rasmus answered as he stood up and grabbed a book from the bookshelf that he had made. You can go now if you want, he added as he read the book about the great era of Neva at the table. Videl nodded with understanding as he stood up and snapped his fingers. He changed his appearance into a handsome man with long red hair, making him look eccentric. I might bring back some souvenirs, Videl said as he walked away and left the cabin. Rasmus continued to read the book since he had been busy teaching the children how to sense and use mana. He didn't mind teaching them even though his goal after he was brought into this world was to destroy it. The last chapter of the book that he read was when the 4 figures graduated and went back to their homes. The first figure who showed signs of dissatisfaction with the system was Serval. She raised a banner and created a guild that began from the southeast of Neva. She then began to make a name for herself, protecting the commoners and bringing them under her wings all the way to eastern Neva. Rather than going straight to central Neva, she went to gain support from the eastern Neva. That's quite a bold move. Rasmus muttered to himself as he flipped the page. Eastern Neva was famous for slavery, and the power struggle there was visible to everyone. That continent was about survival of the fittest, and nobody dared to touch that continent except for the native people. It was similar to northern Neva, but northern Neva was strong and unified, treating each nation as their own brothers and sisters. Rasmus found Serval's story fascinating because she was beyond what he would expect. She upheld justice and protected the innocent, especially women. She waged wars against feudal lords, princes and sultans, strengthening her status in the eyes of the world, and gaining support from eastern Neva. In a span of 4 years, she managed to conquer half of eastern Neva and gained the title Warmonger. I see, so you were planning to conquer eastern Neva and hoarded their golds, Rasmus muttered with a smirk on his face. You've got power, wealth and territory, competing with the other 3 figures just like that. He read the book until midnight and he could imagine how severe the conflict and the chaos those 4 figures had created back then based on the description that the author wrote. Something bothered him because there was something amiss with their purpose in waging wars against each other. These figures. They were righteous and yet killed countless innocent lives. Rasmus sat straight as he looked down at the book on the table. What did you guys know? And why did you all turn the world upside down? He sighed as he narrowed his eyes and stared at the page. Abigail, Rasmus called as he walked toward Abigail, who was busy teaching the new children about magic. Abigail turned around and immediately bowed her head, and so did the other children. It had become a new habit for the children in the village to respect Rasmus. They knew that Rasmus was a count, a noble, and they had to show respect as commoners. How's your progress? Rasmus asked as he went down to his knee. Abigail closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to absorb mana. She imagined a sphere of mana moving around in between her hands, creating friction until it created a spark and fed the spark with oxygen. You created a fire in less than a second, good job, Rasmus smiled and patted Abigail's head. But the real test starts now, he said as he touched the flame with his finger. The flame lost its energy and was extinguished immediately. Abigail looked so disappointed as she sighed and looked down. You still can't maintain the flame, it seems. Rasmus muttered as he rubbed his chin. It's okay. Mages are required to have imaginative thinking, and all you need to do is learn about fire, he added as he looked at Abigail. I did, but I couldn't understand any of it. Abigail said. Her voice was quiet and Rasmus could barely hear it. Rasmus knew that Abigail had aphantasia, a condition where she couldn't or had a hard time creating an image in her mind. Compared to Cinder and Sinclair, who already mastered their own elemental aptitude. That's not a problem at all, Rasmus smiled as he patted Abigail's head again. If one door is closed, more doors are open for you. Abigail tilted her head with a confused look written on her face as she looked at Rasmus. She then watched Rasmus open his left palm and create a spherical ball of fire. She watched as the ball of flame became smaller and smaller, yet she felt the heat begin to hit her skin. Do you feel that? Rasmus raised his brows and looked at the ball of fire that was as big as a marble. If you can't imagine it, you can feel it. The hotter the fire, the stronger it gets. Although this is smaller, it's denser because you can feel the heat and mana it consumed, he explained and then dispersed the flame into a thin layer of smoke. Abigail looked at her hands and began to follow what Rasmus had said. She created a fire and began to wrap the fire with mana, turning its shape into a spherical one. She could feel the tingling sensation on her palms and she began to pour more mana into it. She felt the fire was fighting against her will, but she squeezed the fire until it became smaller. She was smiling widely as she managed to imitate what Rasmus did even though it was imperfect. I did it. She whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and excitement. For the first time, the fire felt like hers, and not just an uncontrollable force, but something she commanded. Another lesson, Abigail. Rasmus grasped the ball of fire and extinguished it. Abigail was shocked when Rasmus forced her to stop. She watched the white smoke flowing and lingering around Rasmus's hand. You need to know your limit, Rasmus said in a gentle voice. You may force it, but don't make it the only way to get better. Just like earlier, if one door is closed, a few will open for you. Find it, and become one of a kind, he explained and patted Abigail's head.
Okay.
Abigail's eyes lit up as she said it energetically. Rasmus got up and checked the other children's progress. When the sun went down and all the children went home, Rasmus went to check out the bookstore. Henry was writing a book at his desk with a hot cup of tea beside it when Rasmus entered the bookstore. "My favorite customer," Henry said with a soft smile. "I read the whole book." Rasmus paused to sit on the chair, across from Henry. It was confusing at first when the four figures waged wars against each other. The power struggle was vivid, but something tells me that they weren't enemies, he continued with his brows furrowed and eyes narrowed. Henry raised his brows, intrigued by Rasmus's conclusion. "What made you think that way?" Henry narrowed his eyes and closed the book. "Let me borrow this for a moment." Rasmus stood up and walked toward the stack of scrolls and grabbed a map. "You see." He paused and opened the map of Neva. "I tried to map their strategies and the regions they used as the battlefields." He muttered and stared at the map on the table. "You mapped them?" "If I remember correctly, they went to war, dozens of times." Henry looked at Rasmus, amazed by his determination. 184 times in the past 20 years to be exact, at least the big ones, Rasmus answered as he grabbed a pencil. "I'm drawing the patterns for you, and I hope you can give me an insight as to why they chose these patterns." He added and began to draw the patterns, circling the nations and areas that were used for battle. Henry was speechless when he watched Rasmus draw the patterns of the major battles from each side and each year. He couldn't believe Rasmus remembered every single one of them. It was shocking, and he believed Rasmus because he knew that Rasmus wasn't the kind of person who made things up. "Yes, I remember those events from the book." Henry nodded as he began to see the patterns. "There are specific nations and areas that each side used for defense," he pointed out. "Even though they weren't the most beneficial areas for them to take or defend, they kept taking these places over and over." Rasmus nodded as he pointed at the areas that he mentioned. "I don't know anything about these areas since their reigns and glory had long gone, replaced by new rulers. But you might be able to find out about these places and why they kept focusing on them." He looked at Henry with a serious expression. "I might have to do my research in the capital city." Henry answered as he kept staring at the areas Rasmus drew. "Maybe these will give us a new light." He nodded in agreement. "Well then, I'll take my leave. It's getting late anyway." "Good night, Henry," Rasmus said as he took a few steps back and then left the bookstore. Rasmus left the village and went into the forest where his house was. Since Vidal went to the capital city, he was alone in the forest, but then he saw a group of men wearing black leather coats standing in front of his house. When they noticed his presence, they all turned around and they all had cold and menacing gazes. "Rasmus Blackheart, we have been looking for you," a gray-haired man with a scar on his neck said in a cold and deep voice. "You know my name. It's a bit unfair if you don't tell me yours and your men." Rasmus responded and counted there were 11 people in front of him. "Well." The man moved aside and the others followed, opening the space for Rasmus to enter his cabin. "Why don't you let us in and we can talk?" He smiled coldly with empty eyes. Rasmus looked down a bit as he smirked faintly and nodded. He sighed and walked toward the door, passing through the people who kept their menacing and cold gazes at him. He wasn't bothered by their gazes and opened the door. "Come in," Rasmus smiled coldly at them as he grabbed the wooden sword that he had placed behind the door, hiding it from the mysterious men. As soon as the man stepped foot into the cabin, Rasmus gathered the mana onto the door that he was holding. He created a wind magic, a powerful one that slammed the door shut, hitting the man's face until the thick hard wooden door broke. The man collapsed and fainted before he could react. The moment the others saw their leader get attacked, they all revealed their weapons that were hiding underneath their coats. Rasmus ran toward the two guys that were in front of the door as he swung his wooden sword horizontally right on their necks. He broke their windpipes and made them suffocate before they could even unsheath their weapons. The fourth guy swung his sword toward Rasmus's head, but Rasmus managed to block it. Rasmus used his left foot and kicked the guy's foot, making him lose balance, but when he was about to break the guy's head with a vertical attack, an arrow was shot toward him and hit him right on his right shoulder. Rasmus was taken aback by what had just happened for a split second, but then he created balls of fire floating on his hands. He threw them at the people that were about to attack him. The balls of fire exploded and burned them all alive. He was protected by Mana's shield so he didn't get hurt from the explosions. He then looked in the direction where the arrow was shot as he created two disc-like winds on his palms. He threw them in the direction repeatedly where the arrow was shot and the discs of wind cut down the trees like they were nothing. The archer fell from the tree he was hiding in, and when he was about to stand up, he saw the wall of fire from where his accomplices got burned alive. He saw a silhouette of a man walking, and that was when he saw Rasmus walking through the wall of fire, unscathed. The archer panicked and he lost his bow when he fell from the tree. He didn't have a choice but to unsheath his dagger. Before he could take a step forward, he heard a high-pitched whistling sound coming toward him. When he looked up, his body stopped responding to him. He was confused until his vision faded away as his head fell off his body. Rasmus looked down at his right shoulder where the arrow had stuck in his shoulder. He carefully pulled the arrow as he groaned in pain, clenching his teeth and closing his eyes. When he managed to pull the arrow, he threw the arrow away and used a small flame on his index finger to close the wound. Magic is fascinating. He groaned as he kept burning the wound. But it can't completely stop anything solid yet, he said under his breath as he covered the wound with his hand. Rasmus looked at the mess and then looked at the leader who was unconscious at the door. He walked back to his cabin, ignoring the two guys that were suffocating because he broke their windpipe. He dragged the man's body inside and tied him to the chair. He waited for the man to wake up as he cleaned the wound on his shoulder and treated it with herbs. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and dragged a chair from the dining table toward the man. He pinched and closed the man's nostrils, forcing the man to wake up because of the lack of oxygen. When the man opened his eyes, he gasped for air and panicked since it was a natural reaction. The man tried to move his body, but his body was tied to a chair, making it impossible for him to move his body except his head and hands. He then looked at Rasmus with a confused look and fear at the same time. What happened? The man panicked and then groaned in pain because his head was bleeding. We haven't finished our introduction yet. I believe you owe me your name, Rasmus said calmly as he sat in front of the man, crossing his legs and placing the knife on his thigh. Russell. My name is Russell. The man answered immediately, his eyes filled with fear and desperation. I believe you're the people who are looking for me. Something about an organization? A bunch of criminals. Rasmus stared at Russell dead in the eye as he tapped on the knife's blade with his nail, making a clanking sound. Russell was surprised that Rasmus knew about them. Although he got exposed, he didn't want to answer. Good, that's what I want to hear. Nothing. Rasmus slowly stood up and grabbed the knife. Wait. What are you doing? Russell's voice was shaky and breathy. His pupils shrunk and trembled, staring at the knife in Rasmus's hand. Rasmus didn't say a word. His face was stoic and cold as he stared at his own reflection from the sharp blade in his hand. He slowly glanced at Russell's eyes, and at that moment Russell knew those eyes were the eyes of cold-blooded murderers. Please. Please. Russell shouted and begged. I'll tell you everything, he exclaimed as he struggled to free himself. I know you will, but in my way. Rasmus's voice was quiet and flat. Russell shook his head repeatedly as he screamed and tried to loosen up the rope, but it was impossible. What I'm going to do to you. If I do it correctly, you'll feel an unimaginable pain that you might pass out the moment I do it. But if I do it incorrectly. Rasmus paused as he stood in front of Russell. Well, it'll be worse than that. So, let's talk so I can't focus on what I'm going to do to you. He slowly formed a cold smile as he stared down at Russell. Russell's screams and gargles were loud and almost deafening, but he was in the middle of the forest, far from the village. Nobody would hear him, and nobody would help him. In his final moment, his eyes and mouth were wide open. He died from a heart attack because of the immense pain that he couldn't endure. Rasmus dragged all the dead bodies into the woods and buried them deeply. His arms and clothes were covered in blood as he looked at the flattened ground in front of him after he had buried them all. When he was about to leave, he felt a presence or someone was watching him. It was his instinct, something that he had possessed in his previous life. As a mercenary for almost half a century, he could tell when someone was watching him or not. They left. Rasmus thought as he stared at the distance. He wondered who they were, and why they only watched. Were they his allies? That's unlikely. They would have come and helped him since their secrets were in danger, Rasmus said as he covered his arms with water magic. So many eyes have been pointed at me. He sighed as he turned around and went back to his cabin. Rasmus cleaned the mess in his cabin, but no matter how hard he tried, the smell was too strong to get rid of. He gave up cleaning it and decided to do it tomorrow morning, so he decided to get some sleep. Before Rasmus hit the bed, he grabbed his notebook and read the information that he had gotten from Russell. The Wraiths. Is that what you called yourself? Rasmus muttered to himself as he read the organization name that was created after the rebellion that his father did. Just a bunch of thugs with connections. He sighed, throwing the book on the bedside table. Enhance. There are no words from Russell and his men. A mysterious man with a rough voice asked. No, the last thing we heard was that he went to Hergel village. A butler-like man shook his head, staring at the man who sat on the expensive leather sofa, facing the window. Does that mean Rasmus Blackheart is there? The mysterious man glanced at the butler. We're not sure. It has been 2 weeks since then, and if he hasn't come back, that means something has happened to him and his men. We can assume that he's dead, the butler answered as he looked out the window. It would be troublesome if anyone found out about us, he pointed out. The mysterious man sat there with his legs crossed and arms rested on the armrest. He gave it a thought for a moment and knew it was indeed dangerous for people who knew their organization. What do you want us to do? I can send someone to check the village. The butler glanced at the mysterious man. The mysterious man sighed as he slowly stood up from the sofa and adjusted his attire. He didn't turn around to look at the butler and just stood in front of the window. We have no idea who lives there. Russell isn't an easy target, but if he really died, that means someone strong lives there. Let's not take risks because we'll expose the people above us and they will kill us all, the mysterious man said calmly. The butler nodded with understanding. Now, there's a more immediate problem that we need to take care of, the mysterious man said, turning around to look at the butler. There's a scholar who has been trying to find information about our past in the capital city. Find him, and we need to kill that old man, he said, staring at the butler with a cold gaze. The butler bowed his head and then left the room. Rasmus was in his home, reading the information that he had got from Russell. He found out that the Wraiths wanted him dead, rather than making him an ally. There was something off about it when a crime organization wanted the son of the man who raised his banner and went against the royal family to be killed. Unfortunately, he didn't get much information from Russell since he was only a footman, a man who received an order to kill. The Wraiths organization itself seemed to be just the lowest one that dealt with waste management. What did you do, father? What did you know? Rasmus tapped his finger on the table, staring down at the notebook. He was trying to remember old Rasmus's memories, but he found nothing. His father, Erglade, was a nobleman and a most respected figure in the Revenous kingdom. Rasmus wasn't close to his parents, especially his mother, whom he had only met once in his whole life. Looks like someone was having fun without me. Vidal whispered right into Rasmus's left ear from behind. Rasmus got a chill down his spine when Vidal whispered, but he tried his best not to show any reaction. He slowly glanced at Vidal, watching him walk around the table, and sat across from him. You're back, Rasmus stared into Vidal's eyes. What did you find? You don't miss me? Vidal smiled as he stared back at Rasmus. Well, I don't find much information about them, and you seem to already know who they are, he pointed out after he read Rasmus's thoughts. Rasmus furrowed his brows when he heard that Vidal couldn't gather much information. He was confused because Vidal was the devil, a being who could read thoughts and made men and women to his knees for pleasure. What do you mean you don't get much information? You can read minds and make them talk, Rasmus asked, crossing his legs. Right. I forgot to tell you that I'm not allowed to use my power on anyone as long as it's not used to help you in any way. If I do, we lose the bet with God, Vidal sighed as he leaned back against the backrest. My power is extremely limited when it comes to helping you. You can say I'm basically your butler, but a bit special. That's why you haven't done anything helpful. Rasmus sighed as he massaged his nose bridge. Let's change the topic. What did you find? Vidal explained to Rasmus what he found during his visit to the capital city. The Wraiths organization was in fact a new organization that was made after Erglade's rebellion. Their purpose was to eradicate the remnants of the nobles that were against the royal family politically. The Wraiths had managed to get rid of 6 noble families, and there were rumors that the Wraiths worked under the royal family or were paid by the royal family. Nobody dared to dig any information about them because there had been cases of displayed dead bodies of people who tried to uncover the truth. You're no kidding when you said you didn't get much information. What you know, I already know it from Russell as well, Rasmus muttered as he rested his head on his fist. I have been wondering this past few weeks. Why did you help those children? Are you trying to be a good guy here? I know you're trying to get their recognition, but isn't this unrelated? Vidal stared coldly at Rasmus. Because I just want to. Can't I do whatever I want? Rasmus asked back, unbothered by Vidal's cold gaze. What about you? Aren't you enjoying your time as well? Sleeping with someone's wife or husband? He raised his brows. Just enjoying your vacation. I know what I'm doing. Vidal raised his hands because he had been doing nothing but indulging himself in pleasure. You know I can't protect you in any way. You need to lay low because those villagers might spread about your kindness. You're not naive, so you know what I mean, Vidal said with a serious expression. I know. Kindness isn't just attracting good things, It also attracts bad things. Rasmus stood up from his chair and put his notebook in his pocket. Rasmus walked to the window and looked at the forest that surrounded his cabin. He was deep in thought about the wraiths and his parents. I need to train my body and my mana control. Rasmus thought as he looked at his hands. I'm not strong enough to explore this new world. He sighed deeply as he crossed his arms. You said you can't use most of your power when it comes to helping me. What about your eyes? Rasmus turned his head to look at Videl and pointed his finger at his eye. My eyes? What about it? Videl arched his brows. I feel like someone has been observing me the past 2 weeks. I don't know who they are, but my guts are telling me that someone is watching me from the woods, Rasmus explained as he stared at the woods through the window. Like using your perception power? He glanced at Videl. Videl raised his brows, intrigued by Rasmus's words. He slowly closed his eyes and used his power to detect anyone in the forest. Once he opened his eyes, he hummed and got up from his chair. There's someone indeed. He's watching you right now, and he knows you're standing behind the window, Videl said as he nodded. What kind of attire he's wearing? A black coat. Rasmus asked as he scanned every tree that he could see. A dark green robe. Quite old with gray hair, maybe in his 40s. I believe he's a mage because he doesn't have any weapon on him, Videl described the man as he rested his cheek on his fist. You said he's been watching you for weeks? There must be a reason why, he said as he stared blankly at the spot on the wooden wall. A mage. I wonder if he's the one who informed those guys where I lived. Rasmus muttered to himself. I might be strong enough to fight some bandits. That mage must be an expert, so fighting with him with magic, I would undoubtedly lose to him, he said as he walked back to the table. So you're going to let him watch? You're quite an exhibitionist, aren't you? Videl grinned and chuckled softly. Just keep me updated about him. I want to know if he's indeed the one who exposed my whereabouts to the wraiths, Rasmus said as he sat down. If nobody comes here, then he's here for a different reason. He added as he tapped the table with his fingers. Videl only responded with a nod. Rasmus climbed the tallest tree in the forest, his muscles straining as he reached the top. Catching his breath, he looked down at the vast expanse below. The ground was at least 80 meters away. Taking a deep breath, he leaped off the branch. Before hitting the ground, he used wind magic to push himself up, landing softly. Almost half a year since I came to this world. The furthest I've gone is that village, and yet this world is 3 times bigger than Earth, Rasmus mused, staring at the leaves that blocked the sunlight. I wonder what kind of mysteries I'll find out there. The world is too big for me to turn it upside down. My lifespan is the only thing that's holding me down. Done with your training today? Videl asked, leaning his left shoulder against the tree and tossing a towel at Rasmus. Rasmus caught the towel and wiped the sweat off his muscular and toned body, the result of nearly a year of rigorous training. Surviving in the forest had made him healthier and stronger. Under Videl's tutelage, he had become a skilled swordsman, but he knew he was nowhere near as strong as those sword masters. He suffered almost every day from Videl's cruelty. Countless times he almost met his ends during training. Those experiences couldn't be erased and made him more sensitive to the dangers in his surroundings. It's time to sell the dried woods and herbs. Prepare the cart for me, Rasmus said, drying his hair before throwing the towel at Videl's face. Getting cocky now, are you? Videl scoffed, incinerating the towel into ashes with a glance. Said the devil who hurt me by explaining to God that it was all just for training. You're my butler, so act like one, Rasmus retorted, walking past him with a chuckle. You made me your punching bag, so it's time for me to repay your kindness. Fair enough, Videl replied, heading to the backyard to grab the cart Rasmus had made for carrying more wooden herbs. Rasmus took a bath and thought about the mage that had been observing him for the past month. The mage had been observing him in the forest and in the village whenever he taught the villagers how to utilize mana. He thought the mage was a part of the wraiths, but it appeared he wasn't since there were no strangers or criminals who came to his house for trouble. So you're not one of them? Rasmus sighed, feeling relaxed in the wooden bathtub. Who are you and what do you want? He muttered, closing his eyes. Once he was done taking a bath, he went to the living room and looked at the bookshelves. It had been a while since he had visited the bookstore because Henry hadn't come back from the capital city. I'm going to visit the bookstore. Rasmus looked at the shelf that he had made that had been filled with books. I'm going to the village, are you coming? He looked at Videl as he put on his clothes. No. I'm too lazy. I just want to sleep right now, Videl yawned as he lay down on the sofa. Don't forget to bring me a loaf of bread, he watched Rasmus walk around the house. The usual, right? Rasmus raised his eyebrows and looked at Videl as he prepared to leave. Videl gave a thumbs up with a smile on his face. Rasmus walked into the village and stared at the small dot in the sky which he didn't notice when he first went into the village. It was thanks to his understanding of mana that he could create a magnifying glass from water that he put on his eyes. He could see things clearly from kilometers away. The floating island was Gratlan, which translates to the land of the great. Since he read the book about the great era of Neva, he was interested in that place. Based on his memories, his father mentioned a great sage who lived there, and she was the pioneer of humankind. A small island where it overrules the whole world, Rasmus muttered as he stared at the tiny dot in the sky and walked into the village. The villagers greeted Rasmus with smiles on their faces. Some of the young women were blushing because of how fit his body was and how handsome his face had become. He became well known and everyone loved him because he helped everyone without asking anything back in return. Is there anything good from the neighboring nations? Rasmus asked when he saw Edouard preparing to leave with his carriage, restocking goods to sell. Same old, same old. But I heard there's a conflict between the Suvian kingdom and the Erlen Empire because they found a new mining cave that was discovered in the border. Edouard shrugged as he counted the silver coins in his left hand. Oh, now that I think about it. Do you know about the Great Era? He glanced at Rasmus. Of course. What about it? Rasmus asked and leaned his back against the carriage, furrowing his brows and looking at Edouard. There are words that have been going around Neva lately. They say the second Great Era has come, Edouard answered as he put his coins in the pouch. Rasmus raised his brows, surprised by what he had heard. He immediately pushed himself forward and stood in front of Edouard with a serious expression. What do you mean? Rasmus asked in a serious tone. I don't know much, but I heard that the Suncrown Empire's crown prince is going to attend the Gratlan Academy. Not only him, but the daughter of the Angelus family is also going to attend the Gratlan Academy. Both are the same age, Edouard answered as he stared at Rasmus. That's all I know. If that's really happening, the world will tremble and I'm going to take this opportunity to gain a favor from one of those figures. He grinned widely. Anyway, I have to leave now. I have to give the supplies to other clients. He patted Rasmus's right shoulder and went inside the carriage. Rasmus watched Edouard's carriage leave the village as he tried to process what he had heard. The Suncrown family again. Rasmus muttered as he crossed his arms. The Angelus family as well, the family of saints. He sighed as he looked up at the tiny dot in the sky. Slowly, he formed a smirk on his face, finding this news to be the most exciting news he had heard in a while. In the book, the Suncrown family was the one who basically won the war while the other figures lost their place in Neva. The Suncrown changed its status from a kingdom to an empire because of it. The Suncrown family became one of the powerhouses in Neva, both respected and feared. He wanted to tell Henry about what he heard from Edouard, so he went to the bookstore as he had planned earlier. When he turned to the corner to where the bookstore was, he was confused by the crowd that stood in front of the bookstore. He saw some of the people murmuring and saw some wiping their eyes. What's going on? Rasmus asked one of the villagers. Henry died. We just got the news a minute ago. His body was hung on display at the town square in the capital city, the villager answered as he looked at Rasmus. I heard they tortured him. He added. Rasmus didn't show any reaction to the news and he didn't feel a thing when he found out that Henry was dead. Death didn't bother him anymore no matter who they were, and he had been detached long before he entered this new world. He walked away from the crowd and realized the reason behind Henry's death had something to do with the Wraiths. At that moment he knew that there was a connection between the old kingdoms that fell during the Great Era and those criminal organizations. It seems they're trying to hide something. Rasmus paused to look at the crowd. Something that might put them in danger, he continued as he crossed his arms. Rasmus tailored his attire and made a red suit of wool and silk. He took his time to make the suit and trousers, which was uncommon. In fact, suits hadn't been invented yet. He would stand out by simply wearing something different from others. That wristwatch. Is it still telling the right time? Videl looked at the watch on Rasmus's left wrist. Rasmus glanced at his watch and saw the needle was moving. It is. I haven't removed them since I made it. Rasmus made the wristwatch with precision, and it was a perfect training tool to maintain and control mana. He had to create tiny gears for the watch using pure mana like a blade. He no longer had a problem controlling mana anymore, and it made his magic more powerful and precise. Is there anything you can't do? Videl crossed his arms and watched Rasmus thread the needle. I lived for 84 years back on Earth. I stopped killing people with my own hands when I was 50. I spent the rest of my days learning everything and trying to master whatever I could. I never wasted my time doing nothing, Rasmus answered as he focused on his suit. You pretty much have accomplished everything, don't you? Vidal asked as he looked at the first pair of suits that Rasmus had finished making. You're not a jack of all trades, you're a freaking master of all trades. You can say that.
Rasmus nodded.
Vidal raised his hand and used the wool and silk that Rasmus had bought. He made them all float and slowly turned them into a black tuxedo in a matter of a second. Rasmus, who saw it, stopped threading the needle and glanced at Vidal with a cold gaze. You could a tuxedo that easy and you didn't tell me? Rasmus asked, his eyes never leaving Vidal's. You didn't ask, Vidal responded as he chuckled mockingly. Rasmus took a deep breath and exhaled deeply as he continued to make his suit. After Rasmus made the last suit, he went to the village to tell Edouard about the news and hoped Edouard could bring him to the capital city. He also wanted to ask about the thug's whereabouts, which had made him suffer for a whole month since he had come to this world. Edouard was checking his farm when he saw Rasmus walking toward him. It's rare to see you come here at this time, Edouard said as he wiped his hands that were covered in dirt. I'm leaving soon, Rasmus said as he showed the recommendation letter from Lenin. Just read it. Edouard took the letter and read it thoroughly. His eyes were wide when he found out that Rasmus had been invited to teach at the Gratlin Academy. His hand was trembling, and the letter in his hand was shaking visibly. Why, you're going to become an instructor in the Gratlin Academy? Edouard stared at Rasmus in disbelief. Yes. I knew someone had been watching me the past few months, but I didn't expect them to be from the Gratlin Academy. Now that you know, can I join you when you're going to the capital city with your carriage? Rasmus answered as he took the letter from Edouard's hand. Of course. Edouard said immediately. Also, there's another reason I came to see you. Rasmus paused to put the letter in his pocket. Do you know where Malric lives now? His friends as well, he asked, his demeanor changed into a serious one. Yeah, I know. Edouard answered in a quiet voice, observing the way Rasmus stared at him. What are you going to do with them, Rasmus? He asked, his expression becoming serious. I'm not a saint, Edouard. Neither are you. Rasmus's eyes looked at the scars on his arms. I know you have hurt people. I can tell you only hurt not so innocent ones, so I also plan to do the same, he said and looked back up at Edouard's eyes. Edouard never told anyone about his past or what he did before he became a merchant. The way Rasmus described him, it felt like he was being exposed even though he knew that Rasmus didn't know anything about his past. He and his friends are living in a village not far from here. I have met them a few times when I traded goods with the merchants there. Edouard nodded with understanding. Then can we do a small detour later when the time comes? Rasmus raised his brows, his eyes never leaving Edouard's. Yeah, sure. Edouard swallowed hard as he nodded. Rasmus smiled as he patted Edouard's shoulder and grabbed it firmly. I owe you one. I'll repay you later. Rasmus excused himself and left to buy a few things before he left the village. Edouard, on the other hand, was overwhelmed by what had just happened. He knew that Rasmus wasn't exactly a goody-two-shoes guy, he was far too pragmatic for that. This time he finally saw the real Rasmus, and it was a bit overwhelming for him. The morning came, and Rasmus packed his things into a wooden briefcase that he had made. He never thought that the day had finally come for him to leave the village, not to mention that he was going to the place where every person in the world wanted to be. Time flew by so fast. Rasmus stood in front of the window as he opened it to let the morning air enter his cabin. I'm back. A beautiful tall woman barged into the cabin, with a blanket that covered her curvaceous and alluring body. She was out of breath and her long black hair was messy. Can you at least turn back into a man when you're back? Rasmus wasn't amused by Vidal's act at all. It wasn't the first time that he saw Vidal in that form. Well, some of those women turned out only interested in women, so I had to change my appearance. Vidal walked in as she wiped her sweat off of her chest. I also fucked a fumey dash. I don't need to hear the details. Rasmus cut Vidal off before she could finish her sentence. We are leaving in half an hour, he said as he put his clothes in a briefcase. Vidal smelled her underarms and shrugged as she changed her appearance back to a man. He simply snapped his fingers and he was already in his usual butler attire. Rasmus was taking a bath in the river while the air was still covered in morning mist and the water was cold. He looked at his reflection and still couldn't recognize his face even though it had been almost a year since he possessed Rasmus's body. He never thought he could become young again, especially in an amazing body that was capable of using magic. Everything that had happened in the past year was a new experience for him. The experience had lit the extinguished flame in his heart that used to see everything as bland and unexciting. After Rasmus wore the newly made attire of a crimson-red suit combined with a black shirt, trousers and loafers, he looked at his wristwatch. He looked at his wristwatch and somehow he was proud of his creation. He remembered when he tried to make that wristwatch using mana, which was extremely difficult. Are you done preparing yourself? Rasmus glanced at Videl, who was yawning and lazing on the couch. I don't have anything to prepare. In the first place, I don't have anything on me, only my body, Videl answered as he stood up and was ready to leave. Rasmus fixed his suits and let Videl carry the briefcases since Videl was his butler. Let's go, Rasmus said as he opened the front door. All the villagers' mouths were gaping when they saw Rasmus in his crimson-red suit, black shirt, black trousers and loafers. They had never seen that kind of fashion before, not to mention the villagers only wore simple clothes. Their focus was divided between Rasmus and Videl, a man that they had never seen before. Good God! Look at you! Edouard was chuckling and shaking his head in disbelief when he looked at Rasmus's appearance. Where did you get those? He looked at Rasmus from his loafers up to his suit. Made it myself, Rasmus answered with a faint smile on his face. You're joking? I didn't know you had talent in tailoring. Edouard crossed his arms, amazed by Rasmus's talents. He then glanced at Videl and immediately furrowed his brows. And who's that guy behind you? He arched his brows. My butler, Videl. You don't want to know, Edouard, Rasmus answered with a hint of warning. Edouard raised his hands as he nodded slightly. Put your belongings in the wagon, we'll be leaving in a minute, Edouard said, and then went to check the goods that he was going to sell in the capital city. Rasmus and Videl got into the wagon and the villagers were looking at them with confused looks on their faces. They wondered where Rasmus was going since he hadn't said anything to them. Until Sinclair, Cinder, and Abigail approached the wagon and looked up at Rasmus. Sir, where are you going? Sinclair asked. Are you going to the capital city? Cinder asked. Are you leaving us? Abigail frowned. Rasmus smiled as he patted the girls' heads gently. Yes, I'm leaving, and no, I'm not going to be in the capital, Rasmus answered as he looked at them with a warm gaze and smile. Your teacher will be teaching up there, he pointed at the sky. The three girls looked up and confused for a moment until Sinclair gasped, her eyes wide open. You're going to teach in the Gratlin Academy? Sinclair shouted, and her voice was heard by the villagers. Everyone gasped when they found out that Rasmus was going to teach at the Gratlin Academy, the most prestigious academy in the whole of Neva. They immediately approached the wagon and congratulated him. They were all so happy for him. You good back there? Edouard laughed as he looked at Rasmus from over his shoulder, holding the reins. We are leaving. As soon as the wagon began to move, everyone waved their hands, waving their handkerchief at Rasmus. Videl watched Rasmus smile, but it was an empty one. He could see that Rasmus didn't hold any lingering feelings for them. So heartless, Videl chuckled as he kept staring at Rasmus. Look yourself in the mirror before you talk, Rasmus said under his breath as he made himself comfortable in the wagon. The wagon took a detour as Rasmus requested to another village where Malric and his friends lived. They took the shortest path, which was going through a forest, rather than going around it. It was a bit dangerous because there were bandits who robbed merchants, but Edouard knew that Rasmus could deal with them. An hour had passed and the forest was so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The wagon abruptly stopped as the horses began to neigh. Edouard looked at the surrounding trees and then he saw people coming out and blocking his path. Edouard. Long time no see. Malric said as he held an axe, a smirk painted on his face. Edouard gave a stoic expression and then looked at the other bandits, realizing some of them were Malric's friends. In his mind, he was smiling widely because he never expected the bandits that stopped him to be the people that Rasmus was looking for. So you became a bandit now? Edouard asked, keeping his stoic face. Yeah. It's fun and makes me fucking rich. Malric laughed as he rested the axe on his shoulder. But what are you doing here, huh? You're smart enough to not use this path, and yet you did, he raised his brows. Before Edouard could open his mouth, Rasmus tapped his shoulder and revealed himself to Malric and his friends. At that moment Edouard knew that he was no longer involved in whatever was going to happen, keeping his mouth shut. Malric furrowed his brows when he looked at Rasmus, but then he raised his brows, surprised to see the drastic change in Rasmus's appearance. He remembered Rasmus was skinny and weak, but this time Rasmus had gained more weight and visible muscles underneath his suit. Wow, look at this kid. Malric chuckled as he looked at Rasmus from top to bottom. Living a good life, eh? Looks like you have something nice with you. He looked at the shiny wristwatch on Rasmus's wrist. Rasmus didn't say a word as he jumped down from the wagon, walking toward Malric and his friends. He looked at the bandits one by one, remembering their faces. Give me that thing. Malric reached out his hand at Rasmus as he swung his axe. Rasmus looked at Malric's palm and he immediately gathered mana on it. A fireball formed above Malric's palm, and it shocked him. Before he could retract his arm, the ball exploded, blowing his hand off. Fuck! Malric screamed his lungs out in pain as blood dripped and went down to his knees, gripping his arm tightly. The other bandits, including Malric's friends, began to raise their weapons and charged toward Rasmus. Rasmus clenched his right fist and a lightning bolt appeared on top of one of them and traveled through the others, hitting them in the chest. Edward and Malric, who witnessed what had just happened, were completely shocked that their eyes and mouths were wide open. The moment Rasmus moved his head toward Malric, that was when Malric fell on his back, trying to run away, but his legs were weak because of fear. The dead bodies of the bandits suddenly caught on flame and Malric began to scream for help as he crawled with his elbows. The pain was no longer his concern, his only purpose was to run away, but suddenly Rasmus blocked his path. Please, spare my life. Malric went on his knees as he looked up at Rasmus. I beg you. Please. His voice was shaky and weak, similar to his condition. His body was covered in dirt and his own blood. Rasmus stared down with a stoic expression and slowly grabbed Malric's axe from the ground. He lifted the axe and swung it horizontally, decapitating Malric's head, then incinerated the body with fire magic just like he did to the rest of them. Edward was petrified after he watched how sadistic Rasmus was. He never thought behind that pretty face of Rasmus, there was a sadistic side inside it. He had never seen anyone that heartless and sadistic in his whole life. When Rasmus walked toward the wagon, he stopped right in front of the horses, staring right into Edward's eyes. You didn't see anything, right? Rasmus asked with his brows raised, his eyes cold and empty. Why, yeah. I didn't see anything. Edward nodded repeatedly, his voice shaky. Good, Rasmus floated and landed on the wagon. Let's turn around since we don't need to visit the village anymore, he smiled, staring at Edward from behind, giving Edward a chill down his spine. Edward could only nod repeatedly, guiding the horses to turn around with his trembling hands. Rasmus sighed as he made himself comfortable in the wagon. He looked at Vidal, who couldn't stop grinning widely at him. He raised his brows, questioning Vidal's expression, and Vidal only chuckled in approval. There was only silence on their journey to the capital city. Rasmus sat beside Edward after they took a short break in a small town, the last stop before their destination, the capital city of the Rafinus kingdom. The journey took 12 hours from Hergel village to the capital city, and it was a bit tiring to sit that long, especially in a wagon. Are you good? Rasmus glanced at Edward, who became awkward and quiet the whole journey after what he had witnessed. You're one of the few who helped me during my struggle. I'm not going to harm you in any way, he said in a calm and soft voice. Thanks, Edward answered as he nodded nervously. It went quiet again and Vidal was snickering quietly at both of them because of how awkward it was. We are going to the capital city. Edward paused to glance at Rasmus. Are you okay? I assume you have bad memories about that place, he pointed out. Rasmus had been thinking about that because the original Rasmus was traumatized, furious, scared, and anxious since he got in a trial where people called him the son of evil. Although he was fine, his heart couldn't stop pounding and he felt anxious because he had become one with Rasmus. It bothered him, but he could handle it since he wasn't planning to take a stroll in the city. No, I'm not fine, Rasmus answered. Edward nodded and understood how bad it must have been for Rasmus since his whole family got executed in public. He knew how traumatized it would be for Rasmus and how angry he might be. Did you know that your land is now owned by a new family? The Fisher family. I heard rumors they're sheltering criminals and selling slaves. Edward said as he kept his eyes on the road with beautiful green fields around it. The Rafinus kingdom has become a mess since the rebellion that your father did. This place is now a safe haven for criminals. I'm not sure if it was because of my father or if this country has been like that before, Rasmus muttered as he looked at the green field on his left with cows and lambs on it. They were hiding something and I believed my father knew about it and wanted to eradicate the problem from its root, he added. The royal family, huh? Edward raised his brows, staring at Rasmus. You should leave this country while you can, Edward. I don't see a future for you here, Rasmus said and looked at Edward. Edward laughed as he shook his head. I'm just a merchant who sells fruits and vegetables. Sometimes, used goods. I would leave if I could, but I don't have the money to do so. I can't even live in a small town because it's too expensive. Rasmus nodded with understanding and ended the discussion there. Up ahead. Edward nodded up in the distance. Rasmus coated his eyes with a thin layer of water to act like binoculars. He could see the city walls, towers, and the big palace. Memories flashed right before Rasmus's eyes when he watched his parents, uncles, aunties, cousins and nephews get beheaded in public. The smell of rotten tomatoes and blood was right under his nose. I need your help. Rasmus looked at Videl from over his shoulder. Videl glanced at Rasmus and knew what Rasmus wanted. He snapped his fingers and it changed Rasmus's hair color to black in an instant. Edward, who saw it, was utterly shocked because it was impossible for someone to change appearance. Not even a great mage could do something like that. You didn't see anything. Rasmus glanced at Edward. My lips are sealed. Edward nodded and immediately looked straight at the road. They entered the capital city after getting checked by the city guard. Rasmus's head was throbbing and he looked pale. He had forgotten how it felt to be so anxious that it made him sick. The old Rasmus was extremely traumatized and it affected his behavior completely. The airfield is at the far north of the city. I'll drop you near there because I can't enter the airfield. Edward could see the cold sweat on Rasmus's forehead. Yeah, Rasmus muttered as he nodded and massaged his nose bridge. They arrived at the airfield, and Rasmus felt a lot better after he tried to calm down. I owe you, Edward. Take care. Rasmus looked at Edward before he walked toward the gate. You too, Count, Edward smirked. They arrived at the airfield, and instead of planes like on Earth, they were blimps parked on the vast airfield. He looked at each blimp that was on the airfield where there were symbols on the balloons that represented which company, family, or nation they belonged to. The blimps weren't using gas, they used mana stones to act like the machine that ran the blimps. That should be the one. Videl pointed at the blimp with an emblem of a gold crown with gold feather wings around it. Fancy. Rasmus approached the blimp as he grabbed the letter in his suit's pocket. Rasmus knocked on the door and it woke the pilot up. The pilot was startled when he saw Rasmus, but the moment he saw the letter in Rasmus's right hand, he immediately opened the door for him. Fancy indeed. Videl went ahead and checked the food. How long is the flight? Rasmus asked the pilot who was operating the blimp. Around 3 to 4 days, Count Blackheart, the pilot answered as he kept operating the blimp. Rasmus wondered how far Gratlan was, but knowing it took days, it should be far away. He could only see the floating island as a dot from the village, but he never thought it would take days. Don't eat everything up. We are going to be here for at least 3 days, Rasmus said as he walked past Videl, who had already indulged himself with the food. What? 3 days and only this much food? Videl asked in disbelief as he watched Rasmus go to bed to rest. Even in hell we have infinite food. He held back on eating the remaining food on the table. 3 days had passed, and they could see Gratlan through the window. Rasmus didn't expect the floating island to be that big. If he could compare it, it was as big as Hawaii. He could see the palace that was as tall as a skyscraper in the center of the island, surrounded by green mountains. The Gratlan Academy building was on the north side of the island, which was hidden behind the Gratlan Palace. The east side had a big and most advanced city called Gratland City in Neva, which was open to the public. The west side was only for royalties, and it was called Sky Heaven. The south side had a city and a big tower, and that side was only for scholars and mages, which was called the City of Knowledge and Magic Tower. He read about the City of Knowledge and the Magic Tower because he was interested in them. He remembered that scholars were respected figures in Neva because they had to achieve something that nobody could achieve. It was similar to getting a Nobel Prize on Earth. The Magic Tower, on the other hand, was a place where talented and genius mages around Neva gathered. There were classes based on their achievements and skills as a mage. The lowest was a mage, then became an archmage, wizard, high wizard, sage, and finally great sage. There were only a handful of sages in the history of Neva, and only 3 people had reached great sage. I wonder what kind of people they are. Rasmus thought as he began to wonder. They landed on an airfield specifically used for the academy only, and that was when Rasmus saw 3 massive buildings that looked identical to each other. The left one had a flag with a sword and wings emblem on it. The right building had a staff and wings emblem on it. The middle building had a book and wings emblem on it. There were 2 people waiting for Rasmus at the airfield, an old man with long gray hair and beard and a woman with short bright brown hair in her mid-30s. They both wore the same white robes with gold engravings. Welcome to Gratlan Academy, Count Rasmus, the woman said. Rasmus offered his hand for a handshake with both of them, but they both looked down at his hand while hiding their disgust. They didn't want to shake his hand, so he retracted his hand and put it back in his trousers pocket. Let us introduce ourselves. We are the vice-chancellors of the Gratlan Academy. My name is Julian Escorville, I handle disciplinary matters. His name is Arnoldi Frankfurt, he handles academic matters, Julian explained as she looked at Rasmus's attire, which looked quite fancy and high quality. Chancellor Lenin is waiting for you, so please follow us, Arnoldi said and walked to the academy. Rasmus and Videl smirked as they glanced at each other. Let me fuck her brains out, Videl whispered as he chuckled. And not Arnoldi? Rasmus raised his eyebrows.
With this.
Vidal pointed his index fingers at his crotch. I can try, but I don't think he will like it though, he chuckled. Rasmus scoffed as he smirked and shook his head because of how immoral Vidal could be. Sometimes he forgot that the man next to him was the one who tortured countless souls and ruled hell. Rasmus walked past the fancy gate into the academy and was presented with 2 big gardens on the sides. It was a long wide brick-paved road decorated with lamp poles and benches on the sides. There was a big fountain at the end of the road with a statue of an old man wearing a mage hat holding a wand and a sword in the middle. When does the new term start? Rasmus looked at Julian and Arnoldi who walked in front of him. He realized it was too quiet and empty for an academy.
In a month.
There are still a few students that stay in the dorm, but most of them aren't here yet, Julian answered coldly. Rasmus hummed as he looked around and admired how great and big the academy was. If he could go back to his previous life, he would copy the academy's architecture. Once they entered the main building, everyone's eyes were focused on Rasmus. They were all staff of the academy. They wore the same robe with the Gratlin Academy emblem on their left chest. Rasmus noticed there was a badge on their right chest, and it was as he heard about the hierarchy in the Gratlin Academy. He had read about the hierarchy in the academies around Neva because he needed to do some research about them. In the book he had read about an academy, there were 9 levels of hierarchy in the academy. Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, Dean, Department Chairs, Senior Professors, Junior Professors, Assistant Professors, Instructors, and Assistant Instructors. Each had a different badge, and Rasmus would become an instructor. Vidal went to the servants' dorm under Julian's order because they didn't need him in the building. He was sent to the dormitory for servants of the staff to let him rest and wait for Rasmus. Rasmus was alone, surrounded by menacing gazes, which was something that he was accustomed to. He couldn't help but smirk because he loved to be antagonized by others. Easily swayed by emotions. They're all easy prey, Rasmus thought as he kept following Julian and Arnoldi. Julian and Arnoldi opened the big door in the middle of the hallway on the 5th floor of the building. When Rasmus looked at the room, he felt nostalgic because it had a big oval table with a lot of important people sitting around it. He entered without a sign of inferiority in front of those people in the room. An old woman sat across the table that looked so fragile, but her eyes said otherwise. Her amber eyes were still filled with ambition and hope. She had to dye her hair black to make her look younger, and she wore makeup to hide her wrinkles. "Welcome to the Gratlin Academy, Count Blackheart," the old woman said as she stood up. Her voice was gentle and yet filled with power and authority. Everyone didn't dare to stay seated, so they all stood up and looked at Rasmus with various gazes. "Thank you for the invitation, Chancellor Lenin," Rasmus bowed as he put his right hand on his left chest but kept his eyes on Lenin. Prideful and full of confidence, and yet still have outstanding manners. "I haven't seen someone like you in a while," Lenin smiled as she observed the way Rasmus bowed and the words that he said. "Please have a seat, Count Blackheart." She sat down, then the others followed. Rasmus sat down and made himself comfortable as if he belonged in that room with those important people. His eyes never left Lenin and unbothered by the gazes that were pointed at him. "As you have read in the letter that I personally wrote, I want you to join our academy because I can see a lot of potential in you," Lenin said as she stacked her hands on the table. "With that being said, I hope your visit here is to accept my invitation."
"Yes, Chancellor."
"I won't disappoint your expectation," Rasmus answered as he nodded and kept staring Lenin in the eyes. "Unfortunately, even though I'm the one in charge here, my voice alone isn't enough to bring you in," Lenin pointed out as she glanced at the faces in front of her. "These ladies and gentlemen are against my words, and of course, their voices hold power in the academy." She pointed her hands at the 16 people who sat around the table. "If that's the case, they can ask me anything and I believe my answers will change their minds." Rasmus smiled confidently at Lenin. Everyone in the room was baffled by Rasmus's words and it infuriated them. "Allow me to ask the Count a question, Chancellor," Arnoldi said as he stared at Rasmus scornfully. "What is our purpose here in the academy?"
he asked.
"To unleash the students' potential, or at least that's what ordinary people would say," Rasmus answered with sarcasm. "But that's not what I'm after if I'm going to teach in this prestigious academy," he pointed out. They all furrowed their brows, confused and curious about the answer Rasmus had given them. His answer was still too vague that they wanted him to elaborate more. What's the point of raising students and unleashing their potential if they can't even survive in the real world? Rasmus asked with his brows raised and kept staring at Lenin. Once they realize the world is full of people that would use them for what they are capable of, they would understand their value in life is only to be used by someone else. "I will teach them not to be naive and make them realize their true value," he added. "What I'm going to teach them is how to be ambitious, opportunist, fearless, and especially to have a critical mind. Even a poor child can become a king, and a lion can put fear on a horde of elephants, Rasmus explained calmly. What matters is what is inside their heads. Once they're confident with themselves and know what to do, the world would bow to them. He tapped his right index finger on his forehead and raised his brows at Lenin. They were speechless with the answer that Rasmus gave them. But they weren't satisfied with his answer because it sounded too ambitious. Not everyone is special, and you don't know that because you never taught a student before, Arnoldi responded as he crossed his arms and leaned back. Sure, not everyone is special or talented that I can't force a fish to fly or walk on land, but everyone is unique inside their heads. I'll teach them how to survive and become the best of themselves simply by making them understand they can do anything without any use of brute force, Rasmus answered as he crossed his hands on the table. You want them to believe? Julian scoffed mockingly. I said that I will make them understand, not to believe. That's a huge difference, Rasmus responded without looking at Julian. I will make them understand for what they are. I want them to understand their flaws and weaknesses and then turn them into their advantages. Just like a harmless snake that mimics a venomous snake to avoid being targeted. Everyone found Rasmus's answer controversial, but deep down they knew that it was important to teach their students just like what he said. But again, they thought Rasmus was nothing but all talk since he had never taught a student, which made his words easily discarded. Although they questioned Rasmus' answers, nobody had anything else to say. The room became silent and nobody had anything to say to Rasmus's explanation. A few of them had begun to understand Rasmus's way of thinking even though they didn't like it. They didn't think it would be a bad idea to let him in and prove his words. You have been avoiding their gazes ever since you entered the room, Count Blackheart. Aren't you a bit disrespectful toward the people you're talking to? Lenin asked and noticed that Rasmus only stared at her or the objects in the room. They're not worthy of my attention. They're a waste of my time, Rasmus answered without hesitation. A few of them stood up and started yelling at him for being disrespectful. Some started to show their true colors by bringing his status as a fallen noble that brought shame to the world. Even in that situation, Rasmus smirked and kept his eyes on Lenin. Even amid the chaos in the room, Rasmus wasn't bothered by the curses those people had said to him. His focus was fixated on Lenin, who had finally found out about prejudice and the true colors of her underlings. Lenin was baffled by the words she heard and realized Rasmus's intentions. You have found out why they're against me, am I right, Chancellor? Rasmus stood up as he fixed his suit. They're against your proposal not because of what I can or cannot offer. It's not because I'm capable of teaching. They did it simply because they were disgusted with my existence. Is this what the most prestigious academy truly is? Filled with a bunch of hypocrites and close-minded people, Rasmus finally stared at those people with a cold gaze. Enough. All of you. Lenin shouted with her eyes closed and felt embarrassed that those old people around her were acting like children. Her head was throbbing because of the words that came out of her colleagues. Everyone went quiet and immediately sat down as they tried to calm themselves down. There were 3 people who had been quiet and those people who still agreed with Rasmus's way of teaching. They kept their eyes on him as if they were trying to dig into more about his intentions at the academy as an instructor. Rasmus glanced at those 3 people and found out those people were the ones he could play with. It was that easy to find people that would be a help to him in the future. It was as if he had just found the perfectly tempered steel that could make a great sword. We have recruited a few instructors that are less talented as Count Blackheart, and yet we all agreed to bring them in. This time, it's odd because almost all of you were against it, and now I know what the reason is, Lenin said as she looked at each one of them with a sharp and cold gaze, disappointed at them. Lenin knew in the back of her head that something like this would happen. She didn't expect it would be this bad and how most of them were blinded by their prejudice toward Rasmus. She was ashamed and disappointed at the same time. He planned on doing this the moment he came to this room. Lenin stared at Rasmus. Did I make the right decision to bring him in? His actions and his personality don't match. She thought about the deeds Rasmus did back in the village when she sent people to observe him. Rasmus put on a stoic expression to hide his smile because it was fun to watch people being pushed down to their place by the person they respected. He could see the conflict in Lenin's stoic expression through her eyes and the way she stared at him. And you, Count Blackheart. You have shown your disrespectful behavior toward them, which also means you're disrespecting the Gratlin Academy and myself since I chose these people personally. Lenin looked at Rasmus with a serious expression. Rasmus nodded with understanding, showing Lenin that he knew he was wrong and admitted at the same time that he did it on purpose in the first place. He didn't try to justify his actions since it had been a while since he provoked someone until they showed their true colors. Lenin didn't expect that her choice could create discord in the meeting room, something that had never happened before. She looked at Rasmus and was convinced that his enigmatic personality was too dangerous to be left unchecked. It's a shame, But I should reconsider my decision. Lennon thought with her eyes closed as she sighed quietly. May I have a word, Chancellor? A man in his late 30s who sat in the middle of the left side of the table looked at Lennon. He was one of the 3 people that didn't go against Rasmus. Lennon's eyes fluttered open and she slightly raised her left hand from the table, allowing the man to speak. I believe this way of teaching is something that we should consider. This is something new that we have never tried before. I'm not confident that myself or anyone here can do this method, the man pointed out as he looked at the others. His voice was calm and gentle. If we just allow him to prove himself, this whole situation won't happen in the first place, the man continued. What happens if he couldn't prove it? Lennon asked as she stared into the man's eyes with a serious expression. Then I believe everyone here would agree that he should leave the academy since he was unworthy because he couldn't prove his own words. The man nodded with understanding. Then we should consider putting him on trial, a woman in her late 40s responded and looked at Lennon. She was the second of the 3 people who didn't find Rasmus's idea controversial. We can decide whether he's worthy or not once the trial is over. She glanced at Rasmus. Lennon looked at the others and knew they had nothing to say about it. Garrett and Esprella seemed to be interested in Rasmus. They have been so quiet and oddly quiet at that. Lennon looked at Garrett and Esprella who sat across from each other. Those 2. Should I be worried? She asked in her head. Is there anyone that has any objection to what Garrett and Esprella suggested? Lennon asked. Everyone shook their heads and there was no reason for them to object to the suggestion. You have 6 months to prove your teaching, Count Blackheart. On the midterm, we will see the result of your teaching, and if we find that your teaching is underwhelming and quite disappointing, we will have to send you away, Lennon said. I'll let you know where you're going to teach a week before the new term starts. That's all, she added. Everyone bowed their heads to Lennon and then walked toward the door. They had scornful looks when they glanced at Rasmus. They knew they had to do something about him. You're not going anywhere, Count Blackheart. There are things that we need to discuss. Lennon prevented Rasmus from leaving his seat as her eyes were focused on his eyes. Everyone glanced at Rasmus for a moment before they left the room. The atmosphere felt heavier because there were only 2 of them left in the room. Lennon waved her fingers at the teapot on the table in the corner of the room. The teapot floated and landed right on the table in front of her and it poured itself into her cup. I was expecting you to be someone that I heard of, but turned out the information I heard was only a page of a whole book. Lennon grabbed the teacup. Although I allowed you to teach in this academy, you'll be directly under my supervision, she said and took a sip of her tea. I have no issues with that, Chancellor, Rasmus responded as he nodded with understanding. I'm giving you 3 warnings. During your trial here, if you make any problem, whether it's a small problem, I will count it as a single warning. Once you get your 3rd warning, you have to leave even if the trial is still ongoing. Do you understand? Lennon asked with a serious expression. Yes, Chancellor, Rasmus slightly nodded. I trust my judgment. Don't betray my judgment about you, Lennon stared into Rasmus's eyes. You may leave, Instructor Blackheart, she nodded up at the door behind Rasmus. Rasmus bowed at Lennon before he left the room. Lennon glanced at the window behind her and noticed a presence from outside. She was sure there was someone outside, but she didn't see anyone. Rasmus was escorted by the staff to his dorm, which was at the far back of the academy. There were 3 mansions that were hidden behind the 3 palaces of the academy. The mansion on the left was for female staff, the right was for male staff, and the middle was for Lennon only. He looked at his room where he was staying, and it was big enough that it could be a penthouse in a modern world. He saw the briefcases that Vidal had brought, but he couldn't find Vidal anywhere in the room. As soon as he closed the door in front of him, he felt something just fall behind him. He turned around and saw Vidal standing while fixing his hair. That old lady is quite sensitive. I was surprised that she could sense my presence, Vidal said as he lay down on the sofa. She's a great sage, and she's the descendant of the great sage. What did you expect? Rasmus unpacked his stuff and put it in the wardrobe. Really? No wonder. Vidal yawned and didn't seem interested in the conversation. Also, I'm furious right now, he stared at the ceiling. Rasmus didn't respond to Vidal's words because he knew there was a high chance it was something stupid. Why the fuck do they have separate buildings for men and women? Vidal sat up to look at Rasmus with frustration. This is just ridiculous. And cruel. Rasmus was checking the books that he had brought with him, but he didn't have the book he wanted to read. He remembered that the main building had a library that he could visit. He decided to go there to read the books that he needed and the curriculums of the last terms so he would know what to teach. Where are you going? Vidal raised his eyebrows as he glanced at Rasmus walking toward the door. Library books, Rasmus answered as he grabbed the door handle. Ugh, boring. Vidal sighed as he lay down. You know. There might be a few women in the library. Rasmus glanced at Vidal. I'm up. Vidal jolted from the sofa and hurriedly followed Rasmus to the library with a huge smile on his face. Rasmus had to keep an eye on Vidal because he was currently being monitored by Lenin. He didn't want Vidal to make a scene because he knew Vidal well. Is sex the only thing you care about? Rasmus sighed as he opened the door. It's sex. It's self-explanatory. Vidal chuckled. Rasmus put the stack of books on the table that he had taken from the bookshelves. He began to indulge himself with the first book he opened, but suddenly he heard soft moans from the corner of the library. He sighed and manipulated the air around him, making it denser so the sound couldn't travel to his ears. The first book he read was a book about aura, another form of mana. It was something that he didn't find in Henry's bookstore. Aura is when someone manipulates the flow of mana. Consuming mana and turning it into a primal force is basically what an aura is. Rasmus read the page he was holding. Unlike sensitivity levels, aura can be trained by consuming mana into a human body, manipulating the primal force to its limit. Rasmus stopped reading and went to the bookshelves to find information about primal force. He had never heard of that because Henry's bookstore was filled with historical events and not much about mana and magic. Once he got the book about primal force, he went back to the table and began to read it. Primal force is a measurement of each individual's strength and how much they can achieve in life. Every human has a different amount of primal force. Some can barely train and still can outdo some who have trained their whole life. Rasmus muttered as he learned about primal force. Primal force can't grow, but research has found that in the Eastern Neva, primal force can be developed through a specific method. Unfortunately, that method is hidden from the rest of Neva and only selected people who have given the opportunity to develop their primal force. Rasmus continued as he rubbed his chin. Rasmus sat there, wondering about primal force and how much he had inside him. Based on the book, when someone couldn't see any progress in their strength, that meant they had reached their limit. It was similar to mana and its stages. Some people were blessed with extraordinary talent, while some didn't even have any talent in both magic and primal force. This world is indeed complex, just as Vidal said. Rasmus muttered as he crossed his legs and rested his arms on the armrest. I need to rethink my plans because I can't do this on my own. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Once he rested his eyes for a moment, he continued to read the book about aura. He took in all the information and knowledge about aura and how to use it. He read all the methods, but they were all too complicated, so he wrote down all the methods and checked the key points of releasing aura. Isn't this basically like how the energy of a battery works? Rasmus raised his eyebrows as he stared at his own method on the paper after he had found the key points of each method. Rasmus didn't want to jump to a conclusion until he finished reading the book. The sun was setting, and he had been reading the book for almost 10 hours. He finished the book and found out how mana and aura worked in a human body. Aura's strength depends on a human heart, bloodstream, mana flow, and physical body. The product is the manipulation of primal force. Rasmus closed the book and started processing the method he had made. Just like a battery, the heart is the electrode, the bloodstream is the ions, mana is the voltage, and the physical body is the battery size and model. He narrowed his eyes as he stared at the spot on the wall in front of him. Rasmus decided to leave the library and carry the remaining books that he had borrowed. He went back to his room and tried to release an aura by following the concept of a battery. He didn't want to follow the method that the book provided because it was too complicated and unnecessary. If I follow the concept of a battery, it should be like this? Rasmus furrowed and closed his eyes as he manipulated the mana around him and entered his body. Next is to gather all the mana into my heart. He felt the flow of mana like a thick blood that moved inside his body toward his heart. He knew how human anatomy worked, and it made things a lot easier for him to move mana inside his body. His imagination about his body and mana flowing inside it was vivid, as if he was looking at the process with his eyes. Then I concentrated the mana in my heart. Rasmus twitched his brows because it was a bit hard and quite painful around his chest. Now, discharge all the concentrated mana and send them to my body. He let loose the concentrated mana, while at the same time keeping them inside his bloodstream and nerves. He opened his eyes and he chuckled in disbelief that he had just created an aura by simply following how the energy was produced in a battery. His body was light, almost like a feather, and his heart was racing, which made him feel great. He then concentrated the aura into his right foot and pushed his right foot on the floor as he released the aura to the ground. The ground cracked and it shook the whole mansion, shocking everyone inside. Since his room was on the ground floor, the crack affected the foundation of the building. He heard people panicking outside his room and they were all looking around for the source of the immense power. He didn't care about them and went to the kitchen to drink because he suddenly felt thirsty and hungry, but then Arnoldi barged into his room, finding the source of the problem. He could see the massive crack and a small crater on the floor. His eyes were wide open and his head turned a bit red from anger. You should know that we don't allow the use of magic in here. Arnoldi shouted at Rasmus, who was casually drinking his water, making the other find out what had happened. I didn't use magic, Rasmus responded as he looked at his left hand. He could feel a tingling sensation all over his body, especially his foot which had become numb. We are not blind. We can see the damage you caused over there. Arnoldi pointed at the big crack and a small crater on the floor. Call the Chancellor, she needs to see this. He ordered one of the staff. Rasmus didn't panic and casually leaned against the wall as he held his glass of water. He also wanted to see Lenin's reaction because he wanted to know if she would give him a warning or not. It didn't take a while until Lenin came in with Julian, and when they looked at Rasmus's room, they saw the damage he had caused. Arnoldi told them what had happened and he asked Lenin to punish Rasmus for using magic in the dormitory. There's no trace of magic here, Lenin pointed out as she looked around the room with narrowed eyes. Since she was a great sage, he could tell if mana was used for magic or not. It's not magic, Julian muttered as she walked into Rasmus's room to look at the damage on the floor. This is caused by a strong aura. She furrowed her brows and was unsettled by what she found when she brushed her fingers on the damaged floor. Lenin and Arnoldi were mildly shocked when Julian pointed out it was caused by a strong aura. Instructor Blackheart, when did you learn to use aura? Lenin stared into Rasmus's eyes. Just now, Rasmus answered as he showed the book he had read earlier to Lenin. Lenin couldn't believe that someone could learn how to use aura, which was supposed to be a complicated and dangerous process. She was baffled because the Blackheart family excelled only in magic and not in physical strength. Not a single Blackheart for centuries could handle aura because they weren't blessed with a big amount of primal force. Rasmus Blackheart. Lenin stared at Rasmus with her brows furrowed. Is it because your parents that you're excelled both in magic and physical strength that you can achieve both at the same time? She closed her eyes and shook her head. Come with me, Instructor Blackheart, Lenin said and left the room. Rasmus left the room and followed Lenin from behind while the other staff were staring at him after they heard what had just happened. Arnoldi and Julian were following him from behind since they wanted to know where Lenin was going to bring him to. Lenin brought Rasmus into the training hall, a separate building that was as big as a basketball stadium that was located on the west side of the academy. He wondered why she brought him there, but he believed that she wanted to see how he utilized mana into aura. Can you show us how did you do it? Lenin asked as she pointed her left arm at the center of the training ground. Rasmus stood in the center and did the same thing again, but this time it was a lot faster since he already knew how to do it. His body was covered in a thin light blue mist which only Lenin could see. He then transferred the aura to his right foot and pushed his right foot on the ground, but this time the damage was more devastating than the one in the dormitory. Julian and Arnoldi couldn't believe it. In fact, they didn't want to believe that Rasmus could create such a powerful aura. That amount of aura was almost as good as Julian, who had trained almost all her life to make a perfect aura, not to mention she had a good amount of primal force. Rasmus was out of breath so suddenly, and his vision got blurry that he had to shake his head. He felt dizzy and collapsed to his knee as he held his chest because he began to feel an immense heartburn. The tingling feeling that he felt back in the dorm got worse and turned into pain like needles stabbing right into his muscles and veins. He's indeed just learned how to use aura, Lenin was convinced after she saw the drawback of releasing too much aura. Lenin approached Rasmus and put her hand on Rasmus's head. She gathered all the mana that was enough to create a gentle wind moving and circling Lenin's body. She transferred mana into Rasmus's body, easing his pain, and worked almost immediately. Didn't you know that it's dangerous to utilize mana into aura? If you're not careful, your body will paralyze permanently or worse, die because your heart explodes, Lenin warned as she stared down at Rasmus, who had looked a lot better than before. Rasmus sat down as he wiped off the blood from his nose. He felt so weak that he couldn't sit properly, he had to use both hands to support his body. I don't know what you did, but the aura that you released was almost as pure as the mana you absorbed. Usually, during the process, the amount of aura that mana produced went down to half or even lower, Lenin explained as she removed her hand from Rasmus's head. The aura you released was close to 100% of the mana you absorbed. So you can see mana. Rasmus changed the topic as he narrowed his eyes at Lenin. Of course, I'm a great sage. Lenin paused to stand up. With that being said, you're capable of using aura more efficiently than the current research team in the Magic Tower. Lenin crossed her arms and was intrigued by Rasmus's achievement. How did you do it? She stared into Rasmus's eyes with a serious expression. Before Rasmus could answer, Vidal barged into the training hall. "Young master!" Vidal shouted as he hurriedly ran toward Rasmus. The moment Vidal walked past Lennon, Lennon felt something off about him. The scent that she smelled was something that she had never smelled before. She couldn't see the manna around him, but weirdly enough she could smell it. "You should rest, and you can use another room until we fix the damage," Lennon said as she looked at Rasmus and Vidal back and forth. "You're not going to give me a warning?" Rasmus raised his eyebrows. "I was about to, but I'm going to give you a choice. Tell me how did you do it, or I'll give you a warning." Lennon turned around to look at Rasmus. "I don't see any benefit for me in that choice. If that's the case, I'll choose to take my first warning. My knowledge is worth more than your grace," Rasmus answered with a smile. "Then please, with all due respect, I'll take that first warning, Chancellor." Lennon narrowed her eyes and knew that she had lost her chance to gain knowledge from Rasmus. She found out that there was more than meets the eye about him that she decided to keep an eye on. She then left the training hall with a faint smile, finding Rasmus intriguing. Arnoldi and Julian followed Lennon and left the training ground. "That was just one book. I wonder what you will learn from those books that you borrowed earlier," Vidal said as he helped Rasmus stand up. "You said you want to take this slow, but why do I feel like you're taking it too fast that you might stumble one day?" "Sometimes falling reminds you to look down once in a while. I'm just testing the water, and I know what I'm doing," Rasmus responded as he walked out of the training ground with Vidal's help. A week had passed since that incident, and Rasmus didn't expect he would be resting on the bed for a week. He never thought the drawback would be too devastating and dangerous to his body. He decided not to use aura or excessive mana until his body could endure its overwhelming power. There was a term for that, which was mana depletion, where the body rejected mana. He was frustrated because he had been slacking off for the past week even though he used his time reading books. He was frustrated because he couldn't train his body, and he only had 3 weeks before the new term started. Going out for training? Vidal watched as Rasmus changed his shirt. "I haven't explored the whole island, and I'm going to spend the remaining days I have out there," Rasmus answered as he fixed his collars. "Are you coming?" He glanced at Vidal. "It's starting to get boring around here," Vidal nodded as he grabbed an apple from the fruit basket. Rasmus walked into the park since it was faster to use the park to exit the academy. He noticed there was a student on his own while reading a book in his left hand and playing with a gold coin in his right hand. He looked at the tall student with brown hair and bright blue eyes. The student glanced at Rasmus and furrowed, "What do you want?" The student looked at Rasmus's white hair, and his expression changed drastically. It was written on his face that he regretted saying those words coldly toward Rasmus. Since Rasmus didn't have his robe to prove that he was a teacher in the academy, the students didn't treat him kindly. Not only that, but since Rasmus was quite young to be a teacher and a bit too old for a student, the student wondered who he was. "That book." Rasmus paused as he pointed at the book that the student held. "There are so many lies in there. I suggest you read the one in the library, where the point of view is from the other party. You'll be surprised," he continued. "Lies? Do you even know who wrote this book?" "He's a famous scholar." The student raised his eyebrows as he looked at Rasmus and pointed his forefinger at the author's name on the book. "Famous for his lies and knows how to please his audience," Rasmus responded. "Beautiful lies are more fascinating to read and listen to than boring truths. You should read those authors who write from their hearts, not from their heads." "What are you talking about?" The student scoffed. "What do you think of that flower over there?" Rasmus pointed at the blue flowers behind the student. "Mechanopsis betanicifolia, a beautiful and exotic flower," the student answered as he looked at the flowers. "Indeed, but it will wither soon because they don't belong here. They planted that flower because it's beautiful and pleasing to the eyes, but they didn't care about the consequences of planting that in a warm environment," Rasmus explained as he pointed at the withered flower that was about to die. "Just like that book. It's fascinating and pleasing to read, but he doesn't care about the truth at all." The student realized there were a lot of withered flowers because of the humidity. When he was about to ask about the book that Rasmus mentioned, Rasmus had left with Vidal. The student was left stunned and then went to the library to find the book that Rasmus had mentioned.